Hey, we're live.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And welcome to this beautiful spring morning in the home bay after a rather chilly night last night. Those of you that have all your plants in, you can put them in again in 2 weeks' time. After we have the frost in June, anyway. Welcome to the people at home that are joining us today for this special meeting of Town Council. And when this meeting is over, we'll have an opportunity, if anyone at home has any questions about any issues that are discussed this morning during this meeting, we'll be able to respond, council will be able to respond to your questions then. We'll begin by acknowledging that we are gathered this morning in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral, present, and future territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This morning we gather with the intent followed by the Living Peace and Friendship treaties, and we do so with respect, cooperation, and coexistence. Councillors, you do have an agenda that was emailed to you. So with this call to order, I'll ask what your wish is with respect to the agenda. Councillor Carver?
Move that it be accepted as circulated.
Thank you. Seconded by Councillor Feeney. On the question, all in favor? Thank you. The motion is carried. The first item of discussion is the continuing saga of the 2023-24 budget discussion. So CAO, before our finance manager leads us all down the garden path again, did you want to say something?
Sure, just the sort of typical recap of where we are at this point. We just finished going through the general capital of the last meeting, so we're going to go over and talk about water and electrical utilities today, and that's both the operating and capital side of those. So I think, you know, Ashley's probably prepared to do the typical walkthrough of the operating for water, and then I think we can probably make sense to do a little review of water capital before moving on to electrical. You did receive an updated version of the budget. These sections have not been changed. The updates only reflect the direction of council with respect to the previous sections that we reviewed. So there's nothing new in water or electrical. We did provide an additional analysis around electrical rates, and when we get to the electrical, I'm sure actually we'll walk everyone through that and what the impact is and how we recommend dealing with it. And then we have room for a closed session later on. If we can, you know, what obviously would be great when we get through the utilities to just have a general conversation about where council sees us in this process and how, if there are any outstanding things that need doing with respect to the overall budget. Yeah, so I think before we, turn it over to Ashley to go over the water would be great.
Well, thank you. So I went over this during the original presentation, but it was many meetings ago. So let's just do a quick little recap on it.
Page.
What page? I'm on Excel, so I'm not,
Oh.
it did say water utility. Yeah, that's perfect. So as the CAO said, there has been no changes to this. And you'll notice in your report in the PDF, anything that council has provided a motion on, most of it, I believe, is highlighted. So there's a little easier for you guys to see exactly the changes from prior budgets. Okay, so metered sales, we're looking at residential 333, and that's down slightly from last year's budget, but it is up from the actual. About 6.3%. Commercial we're budgeting the same amount as prior year. Fire protection, we're looking at 180, so that's consistent with actual and budget. Let's see here. So we're looking at total operating revenue of 633. We budgeted 777 last year, and we came in around 692. So I feel confident that that's a pretty reasonable number at this point.
And I guess two things about revenues. The previous year unaudited, when this was put together, we were probably still short of final adjustment. So we may be looking at these unaudited numbers. These are still from when we started this whole budget process. So we may not have, there may be some change in the final unaudited, right?
Yeah, absolutely, great
So it may
point.
not be as far below as. And then also, we should notice, we did last time through that the rates have not changed this year. They didn't change last year because of course rates go to the utility review board.
Yeah.
And so it would be, our intention is in here to do a rate review this year. But essentially we've had a freeze on rates these last 2 years.
So Dylan, you make the point about the accuracy of the unaudited numbers. So it's May, it's late May. So, yeah, I guess it's the materiality of the accuracy. So when we look at those numbers, I guess this is a recurring theme throughout the budget documents about like how, do we have a story for why our volumes and revenue are down? Like, so they're down versus the historical. I mean, I would have thought, given the growth of the community, all of the new construction, our water volume will be up, not down. Like, do we have any
So it is
contextual?
really more of a question for Ashley, because you say it's late May, but actually these numbers haven't changed since March when this was pulled, right, to do the draft. So
Yeah, but so
I'm thinking there's a missing billing cycle that would be at least partially reflected in the year that wasn't picked up.
okay,
But Ashley, is that your?
Yeah, that would be my, yeah,
So this is just missing, it's
It's just
underreporting on
elimination.
both utilities because of the time.
but I see what you're saying, because it's hard to make, it's hard
I
to.
mean,
Yeah.
council's investing substantial hours in interpreting the numbers, and if the numbers we know aren't correct. Like, I really wonder why we're having this conversation about the water utility and electrical utility today if we don't think the last year's actuals are actual.
Well, this is a
It's very,
combination.
it's very frustrating. It's late May. It's not April 4th. It's it's the 17th, 18th of May. I would have hoped that the numbers would have been updated in version 12 of the budget document. Anyway,
No, that's fair, that's fair, I can take a look to see if,
I mean, the electrical utility is even more extreme variance to the Q3 numbers, which causes me to spend hours trying to figure out what's going on to find out, oh, no big deal, the version 12 just came out this morning and they're not accurate and that's okay. We're expecting version 13 to have accurate numbers. I'm just really wondering if we should have this discussion or if we should wait patiently for the numbers to be updated.
So, Mr. Mayor, if I can.
Yes, please, CAO.
So I totally get where you're coming from, Joe, in terms of being May, and we could have changed the procedure this year and said, let's rerun the section. We normally, plan to. We normally plan to do the budget without accurate audited numbers. That's always been the question of, do we do the budget, when the audit's finished, or do we do the budget before the beginning of the fiscal year? So, normally when we do the budget in March, we wouldn't have those final numbers. I totally take your point that we could now. And so therefore it would be valuable to have them. And it's just a procedural thing where we didn't.
I take your point, and I agree wholeheartedly that we will never be able to have audited financial statements for the budget deliberations, even budget deliberations that would start as early as March, clearly. I guess what I'm asking is how material do you think is the variance between these numbers and the final budgeted numbers? And if we're talking plus or minus thousands of dollars here, micro edits, fair enough. But if we're talking about a variance to budget of 20%, that's a material variance to budget. And I'm just wondering if what's our threshold? 5%, 3%, fair enough. 20%, I have questions.
It goes, I think it goes beyond just not being audited. The numbers are complete by about 1/6 of the period over the year. Councillor Wilson?
Yeah. Let me ask the question a slightly different way. So given that the 692 is probably low, my question is, given what Joe said about the added activity and growth in the town, our budget in 2022-23 was 777, and this year it's 737. So it's still 8% lower budget to budget. So the same question pertains, why or how are we budgeting for lower
Where's the
usage
lesser level?
than we were a year ago?
I mean, it's lower than 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's just dropping off.
Ashley, do you have any comment on how the budget line for 2023-24 residential revenue was derived?
So 23-24 was basically taking the unaudited amount, so the three, for example, let's take the residential metered sales, the 314, and just multiply it by the rate, the 1.063. So Joe's point, stands for a reason that we may be budgeting, excuse me, low. I think the risk is always, on the revenue side, the risk is if you're budgeting too high, and assuming you're gonna get more revenue than you're not. So to me, not having those unaudited numbers updated for, let's say, the last couple months is less risk on the budget. It doesn't make it as accurate for sure, but if we're budgeting for a lower revenue than we receive, then great, kind of thing, But I take your point, and I can certainly try to update these numbers. I'm actually just looking.
Like without going through litigating it line by line, like if you're an average citizen looking at this slide, you're thinking operating costs are going way up based on inflation factors, cost of capital going up, revenue flat. Growth, which is difficult to understand considering we have a whole bunch of new houses in town, which would, unless something's happening, maybe people are taking less baths and showering more. I don't know. I'm curious. The numbers are the numbers. It's just interpretation.
So I just kind of took a quick look, and those numbers do look like they are updated. They are the correct numbers.
The 500,000, 611, or
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
over 692.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at those two specific right now just because of timing, but those look like, so I guess the question now stands, why are they lower this year than, yeah, so that's a fair question. I could
There
certainly.
shouldn't have been a 1/12 lag.
I'm checking with Kim. She says that we're fully billed. We were filled, she double checked those numbers right now. And I'm looking in the system and I see the same thing. So, I mean, we can certainly take another look at this. But it looks like they're updated.
Councillor Wilson and Linda Freeman, have you anything to say this person?
So we have other items that we haven't discussed in the budget. My suggestion would be to
Set
not
this
discuss these two and discuss the other items. Then come back to this when we start comparing on potential. At least the actuals,
Good
rather
idea.
than litigate it for too long, because Joe's points are very important. We don't want to have very detailed conversations about numbers that we.
Well, and I think, if I can just speak to that, Mr. Mayor, two things about that. I mean, one is, Joe's points about presentation are something very significant. Like we, as staff, put this document together as a working document for council.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, people reading it, the unaudited numbers start to be interpreted in a different way.
Yeah.
They start to be interpreted as a reference to our performance in the prior year,
Thematic.
which is not why we present them.
Yeah.
And particularly with water, and this may, have been kind of overlooked in the last 6 months process, but we know that we're locked in on rates. So
Yeah.
basically revenue for water is, all we can do is say, can we control the expenses relative to revenue that won't be changing based on this budget. So unlike doing taxation where we look at it and we say, is this enough? Well, it has to be enough because it's all we're getting. So in that sense, it's not as significant to project that when we discuss the expenditure side, which we have control over. But it's quite significant when it comes to a third party looking at the document. So I think we should take it as one of the things that, gets polished for final presentation is polish the unaudited numbers, because if you look into the expenditure section here, we're missing the depreciation transfer. And we talked about that as like, we're obviously doing that, so it should be reflected there. We all know that, but I think along with doing the press release and everything for the final version, making sure that those unaudited numbers don't tell a story that is inaccurate.
So I think one final point, Mayor, and I'll leave it. We can kind of walk through the numbers because I do think it's instructive. But we had a discussion about the strategic plan last month. There was some commentary about the strategic plan saying that we wanted to spike volumes. We wanted to increase volumes to obviously add to the scale and the profitability of the utilities. That was sort of our plan. And there was some feedback from the environmental committee that said, hey, like we would prefer some conservation measures. So if the revenue is lower because we're consuming less water under a conservation order, fair enough. Like it's just the storytelling on why revenues are down. Is it due to people using less water, or is it just due to inaccurate meters? Or anyway, you get the point. It's just like why are things the way they are?
Thank you. Councillor Wilson?
No, I'm good, thanks.
It may even add a little descriptive section in the utilities. It may be just in terms of people reviewing our budget, it would be worth having a sort of introduction to the utilities that, yeah, I think this is a great note for the sort of quote unquote final version. So all that being said, if we take Deputy Mayor's suggestion and essentially skip over the revenue, I mean, at the end of the day, there's not anything else to discuss anyway with it. Yeah. And then Ashley, we basically just wanted you to highlight, significant things in the water expense side. We already had, as you said, quickly gone through it before. And then we could move it to the capital, but we had said we would review it.
Yeah, so thank you. So power purchase, obviously you're gonna see a big jump there. Now, one thing I will note is I have left the rate, the expense to us at 1.349 in the operating at this point. I know the board has changed our numbers, but it's more of a doomsday kind of view. I'm more than happy to adjust it if council sees fit. But you'll see there that, well, you can't see, but the rate is, I'm taking the rate times the 1.349.
Yeah, because that appears in several places here.
Yes.
And I really think, what's our actual this year going to be 1.2?
For until the end of the year, and then it goes up to 30.8 for
Yeah.
the first
Last
quarter.
yeah.
We could do the effective at 26 or whatever, whatever it works out to.
Yeah, well, I'm a big fan of showing the spread, but I get your point. So yeah, I think we should show what we know is real.
Yeah.
When we can.
So yeah, we debated over whether to change this version. So would council want to see that reflected through general as well? Like obviously there's the fire station, for example, there's some fairly large electrical bills. It will make a difference to change it.
Yeah.
There's
we
all
just,
kinds of pumping
it's
costs.
always good to be conservative. We have an overestimation. That's not a terrible thing.
Yeah.
But if we want to see how that shakes out, we can revise the next version of the show. We talked about whether to show it or not today, and we thought it was better to talk about it today, and then, yeah.
Figure out exactly what council's wishes were. Okay, so I'll reflect the changes throughout the whole budget.
Maybe we can reduce the tax rate.
Just saying. Glasses half full. Okay, sorry. Okay, so then if you go down, you'll see everything is fairly consistent from prior year. Again, the electricity is going to go up. I will amend that. And as I mentioned earlier, anything highlighted in yellow is something that we have amended from the presentation, essentially. So keeping it highlighted is just so you guys don't have to go through and compare prior budget to what's going on now. So it's just a little easier to see. Yeah, so I guess, are there any questions on this?
Councillor Wilson?
I just have one question, are we gonna just roll with the punches with the IT services and then the GEM-JSB, or are we gonna take a look at other alternatives?
It's an expensive little.
Other alternatives in what sense?
Well, hire Joe IT manager from down the street,
Yeah.
or Jane.
I think the recommendation was to start by talking to MJSB, invite them to have a conversation about it, but I don't think we've done that by motion. So maybe this is a good opportunity to do it. We did it with the Wooden Boat Society, so.
Yeah.
But my sense of things is the overall IT cost of running the IT shop is is dramatically higher based on inflation factors and staff attracting talent and
Mhm.
look, I think we're far better off by maintaining our relationship with Joint Services Board to procure that service. The real question are these current costs indicative of the future, or is this just part of the transition as they cycle through they're trying to increase the staff allocation so that they can provide service levels which are going to be chargeable. So I just don't know if it's crystal clear that this is indicative of our long-term, say, 3-year run rate, or if this is just the flow through that's being allocated to us that may actually be passed on to our the other customers. So we'll see. I guess the only other salient point there is like we are allocating a lot of like traditionally when we first had this service, it was around 23,000 a year when I first joined council, and it was all borne by Town General. Now it's got to be a good hunk of 100,000, isn't it?
It's over.
Over 100,000, yeah. So, and we're allocating it out, I think appropriately. You can really see it on the electrical utility. They're bearing a big increased number versus the historical. So it is being shared, but it's real money.
I'm wondering if we have any time in the finance group, now that we're not dealing with Riverport, to take an analytical look at this sort of the make or buy scenario. What's the IT worth from MJSB versus what would it cost in the open market versus maybe there's a third alternative, and just come back to council with something, an analysis that would give us an answer.
So I guess as far as, that as a potential, because I think it's worth exploring, but I really think the place to start is getting a better understanding of what MJSB's perspective is, where those costs are going, and also what makes them up, because we can, as you say, hire someone off the street and pay them less than we're paying for IT services. But I'm sure that Lisa can do a better job of me explaining what we're getting for the money we're paying in addition to the actual tech support. And so we should probably hear that. And I think Joe's got a lot of good points, but I don't want to overpromise that the rates will come down. I think there's a strategy there that it not only increases capacity, but also will result in that capacity being disproportionately allocated to, proportionately to activity. So right now, we're basically allocating it on the basis of the number of staff across the 3 units. And we want to be allocating it on the basis of time allocated to projects that MODL and Town of Bridgewater say we need the capacity for. So we built up this capacity, but we're not allocating it on the basis of time you spend. We're allocating it just across, here's how many staff you each have. And so in that sense, we're paying more of it than we hopefully would be a year or two from now when they get the formula around costing based on project trading. And then Joe's points about external customers and everything else too. But it would be great to hear that from the powers that be over at MJSB.
So do we need a motion to have that conversation with MJSB?
I think it's a good idea if we're inviting them to come
I'd
here.
like to make a motion that we invite MJSB to speak with council about the IT service costs and level of service.
We have a seconder on the motion, Deputy Mayor?
Yeah, second and a question.
Yes,
Not
please.
just- Not a question, but a comment. I think that the reality is that we are tied to this service. And going to a different model sends a message around what we're saying about the service they deliver. I'm not happy with the costs that are increasing. I think they need to be lower based on how we're using them. I think the reality is that we are investing. When I think about this, we're investing in this service in the hope that 2-3 years down the road, our costs will go lower. I am not very optimistic about that, to be honest. I have not seen where consolidation actually reduces costs as much as people think they do. For the needs we have compared to the needs of our neighbors, we might be better off with another system, but I don't think overall it's a good message to send, because MJSB is for me is much more than just the IT service, right? So in a sense, yes, it's a good conversation for us to have with them. Just thinking strategically, there isn't that much we can change about that particular piece in the next 2 to 3 years.
Councillor Wilson.
First of all, I totally agree. I'm a big fan of NJSB as a general concept. But people will spend what they will spend unless you put their feet in the fire and make them pay attention.
Okay. I would just remind anyone who was here at the time of what our IT support service was like before NJSB. When you came to the
I think
platform.
it's duct tape.
It was a host of hangers on in the private sector that kind of came in and did what they could, but they could never do enough. And we didn't have the kinds of intricate links we had with other partners accomplished through software, nor was the software we were using as relied upon or as intricate as it is now. But I do think having that conversation is worthwhile so that we understand where IT sees their service going. And we can let them know whether or not we want to go along for the ride, or are we going to look for an alternative? So on the question, anyone else? You heard the motion? All in favor? Motion's carried. Thank you.
Point of privilege.
Yes.
It's now that the 2 doors have been closed, I'm finding it very airless and very warm. In here, is it possible to reopen the doors or to open a window?
I can't guarantee that the work that's going on downstairs is complete, so.
Say, open some windows.
Yeah.
Fresh air is never bad.
It's certainly cold enough.
This is the encouragement.
Dylan,
This is something with the air.
Yeah, it was working in the afternoon. Yeah. Turn that on.
Because I mean, when the weather's like this, putting that on the floor cold air seems like a waste of energy, but.
Fresh air, it's good for you.
Dylan, just as we go, so we've got, thematically, we've got big inflation impacts in water utility, no surprise to you. And we know we have big capital investments in coming forward. So like we're up 70% in expenses in 2 years over the overall portfolio. And they're all like legitimate, $1 here, $20 there, but it adds up to like 70% increase in operating budget for legitimate reasons. Like who knew chemical prices were going to double, for example? I mean, these are things outside of council and staff's control. They're indicative of the market. But if we go, we don't want to wait to go to the regulator like we want to learn the lesson we learned from the electrical utility, but honestly, like we couldn't, even if we put in a new request to the regulator, how much more can we start actually charge for water before it's just not a realistic price?
It's a very fair point.
Right.
It has to be a multi-pronged approach. We've had a lot of cost escalation that I think was, at least somewhat temporary, having to do with the turnover of staff. So now that we have these staff in there, I know Scott's effort is to really give a better eye to a lot of the sort of smaller increases in costs and where we can do our best to tighten our belts. That's one prong. Obviously, another one is reduction of water loss. I mean, we're estimated to be losing $35,000 a year on that. It's not a make or break on the overall budget, but if we could tighten that up by $15,000 this year, that'd be great. They have identified a couple more significant leaks this spring in their leak detection. And there are some efforts underway with those they're almost typically on private property, to rectify them before we get further into the year. So I think there'll be some improvements. Obviously, the major capital that's planned will also, hopefully reduce that as well. So when we do the rates, all this is to say, when we do the rate study, the way we typically have done it in water is a 3-year projection. And we get a chance to project, will we be able to control any of these things going forward? The big missing piece is demand, right? Like obviously the more demand we can have for the water service, the cheaper it's going to be for everybody. And when we do the rate projections, we look at demand, but typically we're talking about, look back over the last 5 years of new home construction, we'll get 3 single family homes a year type, that's the best case scenario usually for demand. The nursing home coming fully online will have an effect. I'm not sure we'll have to run that through the experts to figure out what the effect would be. And then obviously if in the next several years, some additional density could be achieved, it will go a very long way to reducing rates, but I agree, we're coming up on a spike in rates. We're already got the most expensive rates in the county.
Yeah.
And they will be even higher, and at the very least, there has to be a long-term strategy to bring them under control, because they're not sustainable.
Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, so, a couple points to just add on to that and maybe ask a question there. I think the idea that we need to spread our costs for the water and electric utility is important for us to find ways to pass out there, so that as we're going through this Plan Mahombe process, the community actually understands that there is need for us to have density in certain areas of the town, so that we can at least bear the cost of the utilities, and finding ways to make that work will be important, because I know there's a tension between growth and density, maintaining the charm of the town. So I think finding ways to pass on that message, so that when we come to, and maybe I'm just trying to get my work to be a bit lighter as a PSC chair, so that when issues of development come to the table, there isn't that much resistance to thinking about density where we need it. And I was just curious around the costs in transportation expenses. There's a doubling of, I think it's transportation, and I was wondering whether you can speak to that. Why there's a
Yeah, let me just find the line, sorry. There we go. Okay, so we went from 7 to 13. So there's body work still outstanding on the truck, and it's going to cost around 3,000 to 3,500 extra. So
So this was because we pushed off the replacement
Yes.
a little bit.
so there's just some more maintenance that we need to do on the truck to keep her alive.
Yeah,
for the
I
year.
think in the 10 year, we got, it's two years out for that truck now.
Yeah,
I think so.
yeah. So it's just, like anything, it costs more the longer we.
And
push her.
the choice not to buy a new truck yet is always a difficult one, right? What's gonna cost more in the long term?
Yeah, exactly. So that's as for, so that's, let's see here. And then there's an insurance quote in there for 2,100 for the truck as well. So that's costing us a fair amount with the truck. And then I used the 7823 from the prior year, because that's what we assumed the expense was, but I reallocated the insurance a little bit to make it a little more specific, and then the 3,500 for the extra maintenance makes up the difference. So yeah, it's definitely a swing.
okay.
Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, just a supplemental to that, and maybe this relates to other things. I've always wondered about the rationale between purchasing outright and leasing vehicles, whether that's something that we've thought about and how costly.
Yeah, because we usually purchase from reserve funds, and so if you're
Yeah.
doing that, I think you'd have to say purchasing outright probably, swings it, but if you had to borrow for a vehicle, then all of a sudden leasing, I would think is worth investigating.
Yeah.
With water, we don't currently have the funds to buy, so maybe that is something to consider.
That's a good point.
Yeah, and then I think for me, there around the leasing is hopefully you end up not having a fleet of vehicles that's very old, that now you have to start pumping in 5,000 or
Yeah.
3,000 in them. If you're well maintained and staff are using them well.
And it's low kilometerage, I mean, like,
Exactly.
we're not gonna, just drives back and forth from raw water to the sewer plant to the water treatment plant. So
Yeah, it won't cost us more. than
Well,
that.
I'm sure it's something Ashley can.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. It's a great idea.
And just before we leave the notion around the densification piece, I was reminded in a discussion with the two citizens day before yesterday, when talking about issues like densification and providing for other housing opportunities that will necessitate some infilling around the existing town. I was reminded that I should not overlook what the Uplands people talk about in the management or the municipal planning strategy documentation. What we heard at the beginning of that discussion, and they talk to people about why they live in Mahone Bay, what do they like about Mahone Bay, and a lot of the factors that people like could be adversely affected by an over-reliance on densification. to achieve other strategic goals that we have. So we have to be mindful of that we want to not destroy the quality and culture of the town in the interest of finding more clients per square acre to pay for the oil and water, the water and sewage servicing.
Do they have an alternative?
No, they didn't, they weren't commenting on an alternative. What they were talking about was, this is why we like Mahone Bay. And a lot of, the suggestion was there are issues in the land use bylaw that will change the character of the town. And not for the better. That they may undermine the reasons why people chose to move here in the first place. But they didn't offer an alternative, just a comment that.
It would be interesting to know, like, for example, if residents of the Quinlan were to say what they like about the town, would they say the same thing? Because
Yeah,
that's
these are
exactly
not-
the sort of densification that we're talking about, and it's.
These are just, they're regular household members, so.
Yeah, and I would remind, to Dylan's point, that when the Quinlan was being built, or at least when it was in its conceptual stage, we heard all those same
Oh,
ridiculous arguments
mhm.
from all the same people.
Yeah.
I think one of the citizens offered to go out and with the dustpan and broom and clean up the glass every day from the traffic accidents that were going to result because the Quinlan was going to be put there, so.
Yeah.
Well, one thing we know is true, we don't have any growth, water rates are going up by 40% through 2 years from now. So.
Costs will always go up, so if we.
So
don't have
it's,
any way to change it-
it's a mathematical formula and we're right now on the wrong side of it, so. Yeah,
Yeah,
Anyway.
so just to cap that off, there's a. There's a pastor that I listen to that talks about the past being a place of reference and not a place of residence.
Mhm.
So rather than people wanting to live in the past, it's important for that to be a place of reference, that maybe there's some things we need to capture and keep that are important, but realize that there's a
have to move
future.
forward. Yeah.
The town has to move if we want to continue being a growing town and a town that actually has life. There has to be change. The question is, how do we balance the change? We're not talking about destroying what Mahone Bay is about. It's about ensuring that we can keep what Mahone Bay is about without being left in the touch. So
So it becomes part of the selling point around the land use bylaw and the municipal planning strategy.
and that tension is what council will hold, right? That's why we've been elected to hold that tension between what level of growth makes sense and how do we achieve it with the planning strategy. From my perspective, the MPS actually helps us to do that. In all the things that are in there, I don't see something that will change Mahone Bay for
The worst.
the worse. We had a steering team that actually really thought about these things, had people who are very concerned about heritage, and they brought that to the fore. And so I feel confident that those worries will be addressed very easily within the MPS.
Okay.
So, good big picture conversation. I think the water budget, the crux of the operating budget is representing a deficit. And we know we're recommending a rate study, and we know that we're gonna have to reconcile all of that. I still would recommend that we go ahead with the deficit budget. I don't think it's reasonable to try to eliminate it. I think we're going to have a deficit this year, but I think it can be placed in context. And I did want to just note that when you go back to page 17, where it shows the interfund balances, right? So, Joe, we're always referencing back to this part. The water operating fund there shows this tremendous hit from the capital passing through in the prior year. So we had an expectation that the water operating fund would be substantially overdrawn. That's only in regard to going to borrowing for the amount that we spent on the upgrade to the water last year. So our recommendation was that we do go to borrowing for that. That would be the fall debenture. That would restore the balance here by about 450,000, give or take. I think that's about what we spent. So we are talking about having $200,000 in the operating fund for water. So if we do run a deficit as projected in the current year, we can, like, that's what that's for. That's the rolling account for prior year surplus deficit. So, you know, it's not good to have had 2 years of a rate freeze, but we should just remind people that, you know, we had 2 years without a rate increase when we eventually do have one, and in the current year, we're recommending that we leave this as a deficit. So I just wanted to say that now, because when we bring this next version back, we will be asking council to approve a deficit budget in water.
But this is just an operating deficit, not including capital, right?
It's an operating deficit. In a large part, it is still, you know, it is paying for prior year borrowing, but it's not including any capital or revenue or any new capital. Like it does include principal debt payments that are utilities responsibility, of course.
Councillor Carter.
Thank you, it's okay. Before we leave water, can we just sort of have a little bit more information about the salaries, the increases?
Yeah. Just go back to that. So actually, you wanna, so which page were you thinking?
Oh, page 60,
Like the water,
page 65,
so just the salary section?
yeah.
Just
So the whole thing, the admin and general, the whole thing, salaries plus office expenses, the whole section is quite a big.
So before she discusses that, I'll be discussing payroll as a separate.
It's.
In closed session today, so if whatever we could.
That's the salaries.
Mm-hmm.
Right, okay, what about the general budget expenses or the general office expenses? The whole section is quite a large increase, and is that mainly in the salary section?
So in the breakdown there, the only significant increase in general office expenses was the benefits side.
Yeah.
So Ashley.
I see, so the salary related.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so in our discussion in camera, that'll be more about specific salaries?
Yes.
And there's no comments to be made about in general?
I mean, the 6.7% cost of living is applied in there for the salaries, but I'm hesitant to go into any more
Yeah,
detail just
probably
in
should.
case, yeah, if that's okay with you, Penny.
And does any of this represent increase in staff or?
So we have.
We've had full turnover in water utility staff over the past 2 years, so the 2 staff we have now are 2 new people. And as a result of that, there probably are some compensation changes that we can talk about. I don't believe anything especially drastic there, nothing, there's no new staff, there's nothing we didn't
Yeah.
report. So yeah, I think.
Yeah, for the water specifically is based off of what we discussed and approved last year for future items. I don't know how to say it without not saying it, so to be continued.
I'm asking partly out of my own curiosity, but also because there have been many questions from the public that I'm aware of. About not only from the public, but also around this table about the increase in staff. And is that a waste? Is that necessary? And I'm also aware that in Lunenburg, for example, they actually post publicly the staff salary ranges online on their website as a practice. So I'm just struggling with the transparency issue here and the tension between the transparency and the privacy issue.
So they're publishing salary ranges, not a particular employee's salary.
They're a collective bargaining
Hmm?
unit. They're a collective bargaining unit. I think it's, you
Well-
will do post the.
Whatever the reason, it's a question that comes up in the public.
'Cause I think-
Why,
Sorry, go ahead.
why are there so many staff in the town? So I'll leave it at that.
Well, I think since it's being raised, I think it's important to respond to it. So we're talking about water. There has been no increase in water utility staff in the past, I don't know, 10 years, at least not certainly not in my time. We really could use more, but as long as we're struggling on the financial side, we make do, and those staff work very, very hard. So, you know, certainly hasn't been any increase in staff. The business plan that's produced and approved every year after the budget does detail who works in which departments, provides their names, org chart. The only thing it doesn't do is provide everybody's compensation. So if someone's genuinely interested in what it costs, the budget provides that. somebody's genuinely interested in staff levels and what everybody does, the business plan provides that. They're both approved by council publicly, they're both on our website, they're both updated every year. We could try to bring dimensions of the business plan to the budget, but that's where you start to get into the fact that we have one of each employee. Like their compensation is a person. There's not a union bargaining thing where it's like everybody at this level. Well, we don't have anybody at that level. They're individual people. So council would have to really consider, is it better to bring the numbers and the people's names together or keep them separate as we've always done? But it's all public information. As far as the growth in staff levels, I mean, council knows well, in the past several years, we have approved a couple of additional positions. Those additional positions have mostly been for special purpose roles, like our climate and energy coordinator position, which is the term, or in the finance department, where we've really extensively built our capacity in serving the public and providing council with professional finance services by adding an additional combined customer service finance person. Those are the only, growth in staff levels are really, I mean, I don't mean to belittle it, but there's this perception that is out there that I think we all have a responsibility to counter, that there are runaway staff levels. I mean, our staff levels was demonstrated in response to a question you received from a member of the public. Every year, what percentage of our budget goes to salaries? And that's been remarkably consistent in the area of 30%. That's what it is. I think it's a reasonable level. That's probably the better way to talk about if we're spending too much on staff. But I would really emphasize the business plan for anybody who's wondering what all these people do, because it's a substantial document we take the trouble to put together every year that literally spells out what all of these people do. So that's my commentary on that in terms of staff levels. Obviously, other people may have comments.
Councillor Longstreth.
Well, I think a lot of the perception is, Councillor Carver, is a while ago, there was a mayor, a town clerk, and maybe 2 office staff, and then your public works department. I feel from my experience in government has put demands on small municipalities like ours. Look at all the meetings we attend. I mean, we're a small town. We all attend numerous meetings every month, besides the 3 council meetings we attend, plus all the joint services meetings and the meetings we sit on as courtesies to organizations. People don't realize the demands that are on us as a council for meetings. They don't understand the demands on our staff with the increased demands put on by the federal government and the provincial government. I mean, it only makes sense with all our climate demands that we have a staff person who represents, and I think that's I have that question all the time, and I try to explain to people the services we provide are so different now and so complex. We have to have people with knowledge and skills to do that work. And I think when people understand how much is going on, and some of it isn't what we've demanded as a council, but it's what has been sent down to us from the feds and the province and what the MGA says we have to do too, right? And I think it's an educational piece that we need to share with other people. I think we all get that. And people often feel when they want to cut money, the big numbers are in salaries. It's in every workplace. So the first thing you do is look like whose job can we eliminate? Whose jobs can we combine? How can we be more efficient that way? I understand totally where you're coming from. I get the same questions, but I think it's an educational piece that we all need to advocate here around this table and beyond. And, I don't know whether there's things we can put in the newsletter or whatnot, but it's the honest truth to me, when we have to speak our truth. It may not be what people want to hear and what some feel is acceptable. They don't want their taxes increasing, but, at the same time, some people don't want development or changes that move us forward as well. So we have to find that happy balance, but speaking our truth will always be the right thing to do.
Thank you. Councillor Freeman.
Just a final point on page 67, Dylan, just so I'm understanding kind of your financing plan. So the year ending in March 31st, we ran a big deficit as we cash flowed a bunch of the capital items.
Well, just one large.
The large one, and which is a recurring theme. We did that for Solar Garden and the fire department. I'm assuming you're drawing down on on the operating line at BMO amongst other cash management facilities to finance those things. So the plan is you're gonna bundle that operating deficit that qualifies for capitalization, bundle that together with the capital program and this year, and then that's gonna go as a block to municipal finance court next year, and you're gonna repopulate the operating balance, the operating surplus or the operating fund.
Yeah, we'll be borrowing
not
for will be
fall.
the total costs, including what we can capture of the financing costs associated with the project to upgrade the water lines down
Uh-huh.
to Maine. So, but that will be, I think it's about 450, so that would change the year end there to a surplus.
Yeah,
And then that will carry over into
Right.
the operating funds, and then that's where we have enough money to absorb the projected deficit this year.
so fair enough. I'm just like, when we go back up to the other financing line, those numbers are gonna go up, right? The interest on the debt, so if we do that, is that what's driving the 35 or the 35,000? Is that based on the new debt? Or is that, because I would have thought our debt financing costs would be a lot higher.
And actually, the 35, well, we wouldn't be paying, I think that would just maybe be the short term interest.
Are we on?
We wouldn't be in
Page
it again.
67.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, the interest on long-term debt line where it went from budget.
Under the water, sorry, I'm in
Yeah.
Excel, so I
Yeah,
can't
yeah.
remember detail.
So I think what this, it wouldn't be reflective of paying off that loan, because that.
No,
loan's payments wouldn't kick in until next year, but it might be reflective of the
just
current year's
interest.
short-term carrying costs. I'm not
Yeah.
sure.
So like when we really are,
Yes.
okay. So we've already incurred 400,000 in borrowing based up to the end of March. We just haven't placed the debt yet.
Yeah, I
Okay.
don't know how Ashley would account for whether that money specifically was applied against BMO or whether we're just
Yeah,
using other funds that were in the bank and counting it this way, because we know that later on we need to account for it this way,
Yeah.
but.
I think that's probably.
I mean, at the end of the day, what we'll get to council later in the season here, before the end of September, is a number that represents what we're recommending going to MFC for and how we got to that number, so that will hopefully provide a little bit more clarity.
Actually, can you just take a note on that, on the interfund loan there between the perpetual care fund? I think we just want to make sure that lines up the financial statements. I don't think that does, because we didn't make the payment last year. The 8,300 that was supposed to get paid to perpetual care that didn't. By design, it's still noted, it's the liabilities there, that we just didn't physically journal the money over because we were using it.
Yeah.
I'm just saying we just should line that up with the financial statements.
Yeah, at the end with the final year end though, Ashley, you are expecting to do that 80?
So we've moved all the money to date, but yes, there was like a 2-year lag, I believe. It was before my time that the actual physical money was not moved.
Yeah, all I'm saying is that the 2021, 2022, and the 2023 didn't happen. So we
Yeah.
should just make sure it happens. Anyway, it's not a big deal. I know you're on it. I wouldn't mind if these numbers reflected the financial statements. I want to make
And
sure
we're not
that,
going
I want to
through
make sure the
years.
perpetual care fund numbers are bulletproof, as that's a trust.
And we're not forgiving those 2 years of contributions. I guess I wouldn't want to imply that we.
No, fair enough.
forgave
No, but they're still there.
Yeah.
I just
Yeah,
wanna make- I
absolutely.
just want to make sure they're accurate.
Yeah, okay.
So that was.
Other than that, nothing $500,000 can fix.
Yeah, well, so we'll get an update when we're going to MFC later this season, and that'll give you a good sense of where we're gonna end up at year end after adjusting for the loans. So that's the water operating, and I think the intention was to jump right into water capital, if that works for people. So I thought maybe since we're going through the utility capital, we would just go to the capital sheets as opposed to the 10-year. So this is the page 100, proposed 2023-24 capital water utility. Just because it's a little shorter and there's more information in this version, people don't have to ask about. So what we've got here is a series of projects. Some of them carried forward because they said we had some staff turnover and it was difficult to keep up with a few of the planned projects. Mostly what they represent is depreciation reserve eligible necessary replacement of parts and maintenance on the treatment facilities and pumping. So anything that's being funded from water capital reserve, that's what that is. That's the depreciation eligible reserve. So replacing existing system assets are paid for by that. And as we just talked about, the utility is required to put $130,000 away every year based on the amount of infrastructure we have. That's the amount we're expected to reinvest in the infrastructure every year. But what typically happens is it's less than that, and then periodically it's a lot more than that when we do a major project. And so the balance will grow and then be depleted. And so what we've got here, new water services, are usually a charge from external customer. We meet them in the middle, depending on the nature of the regulation. We have some costs. That's for new water services. Those are not reserve eligible, so that just draws out of surplus funds, which is the water operating fund balance we talked about, which again won't be overdrawn. It just looks like it will be during the year. Hydrant replacement, we just had one, it happens, they get run down, things happen to make them not functional, we have to replace them. Sometimes insurance covers it when they get run over by a truck, but not all. Depends on the situation. So this is an expense, it may sometimes again be covered by external. Water meters just to keep up with need, transmission line access. So I'm not sure where this stands. This is something that's been on the list for a long time. Scott will definitely bring a report about how we want to approach the transmission line. You'll see it in the 10-year. It's a long term. We know the transmission line theoretically needs to be replaced, but it actually continues to perform remarkably well. And Scott got to look at what some of that line looks like inside during the work we did. We removed part of it, so there is a sufficient coating of sorts, I guess you could say, inside the line that it seems like it's holding up much better than the treated water lines, where we've put chemicals into the water that have subsequently resulted in more stripping of the material of the line itself, an accumulation of bits in there. Whereas in the raw water, what you've got is kind of an organic material, and it coats the inside of the line. And because it's pre-treatment, that's fine, that's okay, that's just natural. But we're finding that line holds up well. The water pumped and water received match up pretty well. So we continue to expect to need to deal with it. I guess the question now is like, how far do we go to prepare? And as I say, Scott will bring a report on this, because we've had some recent conversations about which route it should take and why. Perhaps if we're building a new one at some point, we're not going to dig up the old one. That's not reasonable. We'll abandon it somewhere down the road. So really, how do we decide where to put the new one, and how does that inform what costs we might incur to keep up with it? So anyway, this has been on the list for many years now as cutting out access, but when it comes down to it, that may not be necessary, and Scott will do a report on it before we do it. Chemical room floor is one of those maintenance issues, automatic flushers. So this should be a service improvement thing, cutting down on some of the waste. We have dead end lines. The dead end lines either have to be run continuously, or they cause issues for people in terms of that water sitting in the line. So auto flushers is a way that we've been approaching in these dead end locations to flow less water, but keep the flow going, so we can reduce water loss and still deal with the customer concerns. Security cameras, just this is behind the fences, but the water has the largest part of this because there's the raw water pump house, and we'd really like to have security camera out there where we're not there most of the time. This is an increase, it's carry forward, but it's an increase because, like I noted, in wastewater, the cost just couldn't keep pace with the increasing cost of equipment. So what we had budgeted wasn't quite enough for this. ICIP, so this is the big water wastewater project. This is the water portion of that project, and represents engineering in the current year. And you can see the internal funds there, 73%. So we'd be looking at about 60, and externally supported 163. That is just a ballpark based on the percentage typically spent on engineering. We haven't gotten a market for it yet, so I don't know what it's going to cost. But if there's a significant deviation, I'll come back and tell you. And it's down for borrowing, but clearly we're not borrowing for 2 more years. We wouldn't be borrowing till it's done. We haven't opened a line of credit on this. We do need to get a TBR after the budget, and then we do need to open a line of credit because this will start to get going. So just in terms of financing, that is the intention. Actually, we'll have to do a TBR. It would be reflective of things that we've talked about already. So the water piece, but also these bigger projects coming down the pipe, including this big ICIP funded project, and then also the waterfront on Edgewater. So those will be TBRs, basically where the budget's approved. What we should do right away is get those temporary borrowing resolutions approved, get the minister sign off on them, be ready to go to debenture or to BMO for temporary financing when we need it. The TBRs need to be in place to do that. And as we found in prior years, it's important to stay up on the approval and renewal of TBRs, because we had some of our cash flow locked up due to just a reporting issue, and we made it through, but it would be nice not to have to juggle money around the middle of a major project while we get our auditors report together. So that's the expectation on this one, is we will be coming back for TBR, and it won't be, much like the solar. It's not exactly our percentage of 27% because the federal side lags on the payment of claims. So we'll come back with a recommended amount of probably closer to 35 or 40%. And we've had recent experience in how long it takes. So Ashley will be able to come up with a good estimation.
Dylan, just on that point, so just when we have a big capital project that we need to borrow to provide the interim financing, are we taking the interest associated with that capital project and are we prorating it out to the project? Or are we continuing to absorb that within like the interest from town general? Like,
So
I know
this is really something new, and we've talked about what we want to do is track it and include it when we go to debenture. But when we went to debenture on the fire station, we didn't
Fair
include all of
fair
it, so that was less
fair
than we did. So we'll just have to be more conscious when we do the water, what was the carrying cost for that water project? And similarly, when we do get finished the solar garden, we absolutely want to make sure that any of the costs are in that one, because that's also factored into the power purchase agreement.
And I think it's more applicable now with the rate increase and with interest rate increase, and it's more
More
material now.
sensitive to it.
Absolutely, so.
it strikes me, I mean, I know this is kind of like an esoteric point, but it's the only really mechanism I think we have to repopulate the operating surplus, the operating fund. Like unless we to recover the borrowed money from MFC and then repopulate the operating reserves. Because right now that the operating reserves have been, and the borrowing facilities have been used to finance all the capital projects, but all of the interest, which is hundreds of thousands of dollars, has been borne by town general. And we haven't allocated it out. So fair enough, like let the bygones be bygones, but going forward anyway, appreciate the converted on that one, but.
But yeah, especially with the solar, we really want to make sure they capture that.
Absolutely.
When it's utility.
It's no big deal at 0.4% interest like we had 3 years ago. 6% is a different
Different
story.
world now, different world.
Just curious about the service extensions and how.
But to get to that one.
Yeah, well, I'm assuming you won't talk too much about it. How do we determine? So I remember we had this conversation about potential service extension to, I forget this name.
Main Street.
No, Fairmont. And we talked about numbers and
Cleveland.
to Cleveland's property. So this towards on the Stovepipe Lane, how is that decision made? Sort of say, well, this is one we can do. Vis-a-vis this other one we cannot do. How do you?
No, it's a good question. So we've looked at a whole bunch of different ones in recent times. We've looked at extremities of town. We've looked at areas that are unserved, like Kinburn has a stretch that is unserved. So in this case, one thing is this should only be put, I explained this under wastewater, but this should actually be half extension and half renewal, because what happened was a new resident came in and cleared a property with the intention to build a home. And we're normally requiring someone who's building a new home to connect to the nearby water main. The nearby main that serves the adjacent property on Stovepipe was never built to kind of service multiple homes. It's an older line. So we would have to upgrade it to that property, and then we would have to extend it the remainder of the distance. The actual extension is not, it's not a very substantial amount. So I think in this case, it's more about, we tell people they have responsibility to connect. And then when we come back and realize that the infrastructure is not adequate for the connection, then that's kind of a problem for us. There's one and possibly two other like developable lots there, but it would be up to the property owners to just because the property is eligible to be subdivided and there's access, doesn't mean they'll ever take up on that. So that's down the road, you know, a possibility. So I think if we ran the numbers on this, we're talking about definitely one single family home and, you know, paying $20,000 for the new part. And that's not great. That's not a great payback for water or sewer, but the tax rate payback is, you know, it's fairly substantial. And I think it's more about the principle that we have an adjacent line and we normally wouldn't think twice to say you have to connect to it. But we cut some corners on stovepipe and we never put in we never paved it. So I think the town always thinks when we're gonna pave a street, that's when we would make sure that the lines under the street are adequate, and they just were not put in with that intention. So, yeah, that's my explanation as far as this one goes. It's not quite as rigorous as we might have done with the $600,000 proposal for Kinburn or Fairmont.
Counselor Phoenix, next and Counselor.
Interesting conversation, interesting question from the gallery at the land use bylaw meeting last week about if you have a development or to build a new house and it's running and there are services that are adjacent to the property, you're required to hook up. I thought that was it. I thought you handled that question well. And I could definitely still see folks that want to kind of have off-grid construction if they aren't forced to hook up. So
We
I think
still
from
have
a
a
policy,
tension there. I mean, technically, it's 100 feet from the corner of the building to the nearest main. And we've had one that was 115,
okay,
where they were asking if they could be allowed to build a well. And I believe Scott convinced them that they should go ahead with connecting to the main. But we do get that. We do get people saying, can we build a well? We'd like to build a well, and it's really, the proliferation of wells is really against our interest
Yeah.
as a water provider.
For a lot of
Yes.
reasons.
Yeah.
As a health provider.
Yeah, and once you have it, you're gonna sunk a cost, the next house down the road, they're not gonna pay to run it past their neighbors who built a well, and so you've given up, any potential development in that direction.
Yeah.
And then you get water table issues and people come to you asking about their wells going dry.
Yeah, my
Counselor now.
comment was along the same lines. We're looking at trying to build our water utilities that we have more customers like that. So if we're expecting to do that, we have to go ahead and do some extensions, et cetera, do that extra work. Because otherwise, we're not gonna get the extra customers to use more water.
And that'll become really significant if we get a proposal for a multi-unit in an unserved area. And again, Kinburn is an obvious one because there's already a multi-unit there
Mhm.
and it's the end of the line.
Mhm.
And we'll have to extend if another one came along. And I think you're right that we really, we need to be prepared to do that, but we also need the private sector to be ready to develop. And in this case, it's a single home, but in other cases, it's a larger.
How many wells are there in town? Yeah.
That's a good question. I would say there are dozens, but I don't have to say.
Okay.
Kinburn,
Hawthorne.
Hawthorne is all wells.
All wells,
Yes,
yeah.
and Kinburn and Park have some, and then at the end, the extremities.
Short-sighted.
No water supplies on Edgewater and no water supplies on the end of Main past the wastewater facility.
I think the boat was missed when Hawthorne started developing and we didn't put water up there.
well,
But
Well,
as I
Look
understand,
forward and.
people don't have to take water. Sewer they take, or they pay for, if it goes past their house.
Well, it's kind of the other way around, because in town, we don't actually charge anything for sewer. So basically, if you pay taxes, you're getting sewer if you have it, and you're paying for it either way, whether you have it or you don't.
But you don't have to take town water.
You have to take water if your building is within 100
100
feet of an
feet,
existing
okay.
line, yeah.
Alright.
So it's upon us to actually improve the infrastructure so that every lot.
Would be within 100
Within
feet.
100 feet?
is that regulated?
Yes, yeah, that's through the board, and I mean, we could possibly ask to increase that, but we'd have to be willing to build out the infrastructure to deal with it,
Interesting.
We should maybe investigate.
Yeah, well,
What's
I
the
mean,
cost
we'll be
involved?
going to the board with a general rate application, as we talked about on the financial side, so we could look at the regulations. I'm not sure what's typical actually around the province, if more than 100 has, I've seen 100 in another place, I'm not sure if that's just the board's rule is 100 everywhere, but it is regulated.
Mhm. Interesting.
Okay.
The next page, we got reserve pump replacement. Again, just, it's gotta happen. I take Scott's word for these things. Water flow meter at the water plant was one of the recommendations on our, flow, like better understanding loss of water in the system and where flows are. So I think we agreed to that last year. It's been done. Gate valves, again, it's an ongoing thing. Every year, we're doing gate valve replacement. Thermal imager and underground locator, I mentioned, these are shared. The proposal is that these are shared pieces of equipment between utilities. So there's a bit reflected in each utility. This is something that staff feel would give them a lot of, information to reduce the cost of unnecessary digging and exploration. So, it should pay off in terms of staff time, but they're expensive pieces of equipment. And old water pump house carried forward, so this just repairs. Okay, I'm not sure about that one, but yeah, so everything that we didn't have concluded was just carried forward, and the level control valve's another one of those. So the crux of all this is water capital, borrowing and water surplus funds and external sources are detailed below. And essentially the borrowing is just that, a big ICIP project. Everything else is being managed through water depreciation. Comes in at 130,000, we're looking at spending 130,000. Water surplus is only taking a very small hit because there's not that much of it to go around. And external sources reflects, again, only the ICIP project. So it's a pretty modest, it's a 16 projects, but it's a pretty modest list. There's only one really substantial one.
Going back to number 15, the old water pump house replacement of the roof. What's in there that we would have to really repair the roof to make it, do we know what's in that old pump house?
So my take, and this is why I paused for a second in terms of the wording, I was like, because I think this was just repairs to the roof at the currently functional raw water pump house. There's no old raw water pump house, there's an old treatment facility building.
Yeah. That's
So
what I was wondering.
maybe there's a mistake where this refers to that rather than, it shouldn't be both.
I was just wondering, there's probably nothing in that old pump house. I mean, it's still there as far as I know. But
Yeah, so we do maintain it as a usable alternative, and there's a breakdown in the plan, so we have run drills of filling it and using it just in case, it just is it's a fallback. So I don't know if, like, we're not prepared to write it off, I guess, from that perspective, we've kept it functional. But again, it is just as a redundant system, but I'm not actually sure if this refers to that or
yeah.
it refers to the actual current
Okay.
pump house, so we'll just check the names, because I would never say capitalize old water pump house, usually it's old treatment plant or current raw water pump house.
Deputy Mayor.
Since the CEO has mentioned something about potentially thinking about replacing the transmission line. Was it the transmission line? Or? Yeah. I've always wondered why we have to pump water from all the way there, come and process it somewhere else. And why the treatment facility was not built right there. Maybe there's a reason back in the day. And if we're going to invest in doing something like that, will there be conversation as to whether what we're doing is the best and most efficient way to handle it, and whether rather, so what I'm thinking about is that we have a system that was built a very long time ago, probably has inbuilt inefficiencies in it, and what we are doing and we'll consistently be doing is trying to improve an old system that probably wasn't, from my perspective, maybe not very well designed and thought out. And rather than continue to do that, whether there's a point where we say, well, it might be cheaper. Now, it doesn't need to be the conversation here, but if you're going to come at some point, so say, well, we need to replace our transmission line, whether those are considerations that would be in place, or whether we'd just be thinking we're just improving, we're gradually trying to improve an inefficient system.
I think it's always worth looking at alternatives. I mean, I think there's a really practical reason why the reservoir is where it is, because it's the height of land and so it's gravity fed. Weather same. Was that
same height from where we're pumping it from?
it doesn't seem to be. I mean, I know to the layperson that does seem higher, but I'm sure they picked Long Hill after really extensively determining it was the height of land.
Yeah.
I think you typically, and again, not a treatment engineer, but you do want the treatment facility and the reservoir closer together rather than pumping a long way to the reservoir, I think typically, but you know, we always should look at that, and our engineers are doing a system assessment report this year. It's one of the operating items. So, you know, we'll have another assessment of, is everything working the way that it should be? But you're right, we always kind of get into tunnel vision of like, this is what we've got, so this is what we've got to work with. So it's worth asking, but I think we'll come back to probably this is the logical way to do it, but that doesn't mean it's not worth asking.
Just wondering whether, how efficient it would be to pump treated water from there over to here, though.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure there's much justification. I mean, you're pumping it anyway. So then it's just a question of treating it one place or the other. Well, you don't want it to sit any longer than it possibly has to.
Yeah.
And there's a secondary treatment where it runs back through the plant on its way up to town. So at the very least, you need that secondary treatment at the reservoir.
Really fascinating conversation now.
Yeah, it's really complicated.
Yeah, really
But
interesting.
and interesting that even when they put it in 49, they obviously, you know, looked around at, you know, here's the only source of water. And here's the height of land, and let's run this 3-kilometer line, and it seemed logical in 1949 with, you know, and I'm sure the costs for the time were quite substantial, and it seems like.
And I'm
most
sure it
today.
contributes to the pressure that's there, to have the reservoir sitting up there.
Yeah, the reservoir definitely has to be high land. In other communities, like where I had previously worked, we had sand pipes and elevated towers in order to get the gravity necessary, and we don't, and they're very expensive. So if we can avoid it, now we might need to talk, if we ever talk about, you know, actively serving some of the other heights of land, you know, we still can use that. We still could use a standpipe in a location. If it's at the top of a development, it'll feed that development, you know, so then you only need one pump to get it up there. But that's good for Hawthorne. Like that might have been something we would have had to consider, but.
Councillor Kerr.
Sorry for going more sideways on this, but what was the situation pre-1949?
And people just say, well,
As wells,
Buckets.
everywhere in town.
There was no water system.
No water system before 1949, thank you.
so that's when Carl's dad, I guess, famously came around.
No, Toby Dodd. Yeah,
Down the road and microphone saying the water's coming, the water's coming, as it works its way down through the system.
It's not as following.
But it also is a great testament to collective action that, you know, residents decided at that time we needed a system, and it is possible to get everybody together and do something like that, even though it's such a huge project. And wastewater likewise was a huge project in the 90s, tying it all together was a huge project.
So was it like public subscription, when you say people got together, or was that just public pressure?
My understanding, Kelly is probably the expert of all of us, is that they, you know, got together and had a vote where people agreed to take on the $150,000 debt that had to be taken on at the time. But I think it was just a difference in the way the town operated. I don't think those people were personally liable for that debt. For sidewalks, we did. We had businesses came to us and said, we'll share the cost, and that's how we expanded the sidewalks was at that time.
I think it was a good review, Dylan, of water. Just one question around the methodology of when you decide to borrow versus just draw down on the reserve. So in this case, we have modest borrowing. It's in the context of a bunch of borrowing. So the 63,000. So I'm just wondering, like, how do you determine whether that makes sense versus just draw another 60 out of the reserve?
So the only borrowing here is the big externally funded project, and it's just impossible to do it any other way.
Because it qualifies.
It's just our share. Our share in this year would be, but we wouldn't be borrowing it at 60. We'd be borrowing it when it's 2 million.
I gotcha. Fair enough. Okay.
That's an interesting question, and I wonder, do we have a policy about that? How
We don't, I mean, we do, because you brought it up, the old policy around, and it provides some general instruction. It was
about borrowing?
it's called reserve policy, but so
Yeah.
Ash has also been asked by council to come up with a new reserve policy, and I think that's where we would say, you know, these reserves are maintained for this purpose. This provides direction as to when you would use the reserves to fund
Versus
an
borrowing.
expenditure. Well, the assumption is if you're not using the reserve, you're either doing it at a borrowing or at a revenue. And I guess this year we've had a lot more, you know, willingness to contemplate capital and a revenue, and we may find that going forward we want to, but that's typically not managed by a policy. That's usually just done in the budget process. The thing you know is you can use reserves, and then if you can't use reserves, you got to figure it out.
And maybe not do it.
Are we funding a rate study before the end of this term?
Yeah, it is in
It
here.
is.
I mean, I don't know if, like, we thought we would actually start it now. I think at this point, we're looking at after the audit work is mostly complete, but that still could be done over the summer. Could be done to council as early as September.
Think to the deputy.
We hope
mayor's
that
point.
means a January 1 effective date, but again, we're stuck in this thing with the board where we're at their mercy once we apply.
So if we receive a rate increase, that doesn't necessarily mean we have to reflect that price point to the customer, does it? Or are we required to?
Yeah, I think we're required to charge what they, so we do a rate study. We don't have to ask for what the rate study justifies, but whatever we ask for, if the board tells us that's a new rate, we have to charge that rate. So there could be some room between the rate study and what we decide we need to ask for. But that'll be for council to discuss, and I think we should have it by early fall, because I'd love to get the rates effective January 1 instead of April 1, but.
Not to litigate that this morning, but like, that's a big number, right? That's gonna be like several $100,000 would have to get to get a rate of return on water, given the capital, right? I think we're running $150,000 deficit. We've got several $1 million worth of anticipated higher borrowing costs with inflation factors going up yet.
So basically what happened last time, we went through a rate study, and then we had a 3-year period, and then we had 2 years after it, we didn't do an increase. Basically 5 years, the rate study, we applied for increases over the first 3, I think it about almost 30%. So over 5 years, we had about 30% increase, substantial, but 6% a year. That ended up effectively paying not for what it was intended to pay for, which at the time, you'll remember, was this capital.
Yeah.
That didn't happen at the time, so we couldn't get external funding.
Operating.
It was the incidental increases in operating costs that happened in that same time frame.
Exactly.
So now we're back in that same situation of saying, well, no, we need another 30% in order to deal with the capital costs. And the 30% we already had just went to the increasing costs of chemicals and electricity and everything else, and staff costs this year. And
Like just the back of a napkin, we need another $250,000 a year to fund capital plus operating expenses, cover the deficit, build the reserve.
so the town may have the same conversation as we had this year about fire, about, what's driving it is capital debt. How do we manage the town and the utility in terms of the capital debt, like the utilities portion being somewhere over $1 million. If the utility can't accommodate that within rates, should it or should it not be accommodated within the utility rates?
Or you mean a transfer from general?
Yeah, because we didn't increase fire rates this year either to fully, we are increasing.
I think that's where we are. Like, I think if you look at our overall budget, like we haven't funded these things through town general. The town generals where the revenue's coming. I don't think it's reasonable to think that we're going to be able to pass through another 40% water rate increase a year and a half from now.
Yeah,
But that's what we need.
I think the strategy becomes like with fire, you say, well, okay, so if over 5 years we sufficiently grow demand and, it meets up, then if the town general carries it in the shorter term, there's a point at which, based on a strategy, but I think Deputy Mayor made the point earlier, that strategy has to actually be borne out in our land use planning
Yeah,
and
and
in the building of actual units.
You better write it down too.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks for that.
No, it's good. It's all good context. So is everyone good to move to electrical then?
Yeah, we pretty well killed the water.
So Ashley, we'll take it back to the electrical operating, I guess on page 69. And
Yeah,
just at a high level, because of course, when we presented this, we added the caveat that this was based entirely on estimates, assumptions that, now some of those have changed. We have a new rate, so
Yep.
I don't know if you want to launch into the rate.
I do, yeah.
report.
So the rate report I sent you all this morning, the electric utility rate adjustment. This will, so like the CAO just said, the revenue side on the budget is still based on the 1.349 rate increase that we asked for. So what I wanted to do on this report is show what we asked for and what we expected for revenue versus what we are getting. So we were looking at with 34.9% increase, we're looking at a $2.8 million expected revenue.
That's what you would have found on page 69.
So this is literally a copy from that page, so it's the revenue from that. So then if I'm gonna scroll down, I don't know
On
where.
the basis of which we presented a balanced budget.
Yes,
So, you're looking at expenditures in the same, and now.
and now the revenue's
The
lower.
revenue's not gonna be.
Exactly, so what the UARB has said is that it's effective April 28th, but for just ease of calculations, I made it May 1st. The 3-day difference is not gonna make a huge difference in this calc, so. But basically, May 1st to December 31st, we get a 20% increase. So I calculated the revenue, the expected revenue of 1.67. We have already billed for the April 23rd of prior year, so that would be included in there. So the total estimated revenue up to and including December 31st, 2023, we're looking at 1.8 million. And then the UARB said between, so starting January 1st, 2024, we are going to have a 30.6% increase. So that's 91 days left in this fiscal year. So that's for Q4. So we're looking at revenue of 375. So in total, 675. Sorry, thank you.
Actually, which
yeah.
page are we on?
Sorry, this is what I sent via email this morning. I sent this in an email this morning.
Oh, the separate one.
Yeah,
Okay,
sorry.
thank you.
No, that's fine. So we're looking at total revenue for the year with the rate increases UARB as allowed of 2.5 million. So that less what we expected, we're looking at a loss of 266,000 in revenue. As I mentioned in our email, we were, how do we fund this? How do we cope? How do we, retrieve this? And I think the ideal thing is for the town to loan the utility that money with agreed upon interest rate, a reasonable agreed upon interest rate to kind of recoup those losses.
Yeah, it should add that the board did rule that this is recoverable, so.
Yes.
If we went out and borrowed it, or if we borrowed it from ourselves, the full cost, including the borrowing, would end up being reflected in the subsequent rate, so basically. We're talking about a rate increase that is effective now and another one that's effective January 1, but we also know that there will be another one the following year.
Yeah.
And that could be reflective of this 266 plus the financing costs associated. So where we could go to the private sector, at the end of the day, we also could go to ourselves, and I guess it's just a matter of the cost to the utility customer is the same. Or it could be the same if we charge the same rate. Is it in our interest to pay ourselves the interest versus paying another party? So this is significant as an intro because, the revenue we projected is going to be short, and we have looked at, could we do anything about it other than run a deficit? And we're not really seeing much room. There's a tiny bit of room, but nowhere near $266,000 of room.
Exactly.
So the big question is, where do we cover that from? If the utility actually runs a deficit, it doesn't have the funds in the bank to cover it. Because we ran a deficit this year, we had to cover that.
Yeah.
So if we bundled up the perpetual care fund reserve and set up a 5-year loan at 5% or 7% or whatever we think is fair, or use BMO or what have you, that's the plan. But to actually set up a loan.
But if we did it formally from Perpetual Care, for example, rather than BMO making the interest, then Perpetual Care would probably be able to get more money than leaving their money in the bank and collecting interest on it.
Yeah, so that strikes me as an appropriate use of funds.
I know we talked about whatever it's a loan for, Perpetual Care loaning money is a concept that we may want to use. And then it's just a question of, does it matter what for if the return is the same at the end of the day?
I guess the point is we're gonna finance the smoothing as per the direction of the regulator.
Yeah.
Based on your request. And actually, Dylan, when you read through the answer of the URB ruling, I think was your answers to those questions were outstanding. They really are elegantly, they would just, there was it was an elegant presentation that really, I think that saved the day around getting that. So, frame that on your wall, put that on your CV.
It still left us with $250,000 short.
It did.
Nice if it didn't do that,
So-
but it's not on that.
I don't want to belabor the point on page 69, but I think the utility financials always mystify me a bit. And so I don't understand, or, well, maybe I understand. I don't understand the thematically what's happening at the utility. When I look at 69, and it's kind of a similar story to what we talked about on the water, so it might take a second set of eyes. So for example, I would have expected last year last year's fiscal period, we would have run a very material deficit as we were losing money on every kilowatt we sold in the fourth quarter. But when we look in the financials, that's not the case. And so, I'm wondering like, why how did our operating margins improve when we were selling at a loss versus the previous year? So just inconsistent, like why is the profitability increased when we know we ran an operating deficit? And I'm assuming it's because we still haven't got the final revenue numbers and the final cost of goods sold with area not nailed down.
I think this is the same question as with water, and I guess turn it to Ashley, but I would assume the answer is the same. We need to go back and make sure that these numbers are accurate.
Yep,
Because
if it's a timing.
If this is really the story, I totally agree. This is a strange story. I would not be able to justify, but unaudited, we're just that,
Yeah, I can take a look and,
rather than doing it on the fly, we've already said we'll revise and come back, so.
yeah.
Sorry. Just to.
Yes, please.
just to run back to Joe's comment. I don't understand, as I recall, the original budget for the utility assumed a very large increase in our power costs because of this mess we had with New Brunswick at the end of the year.
Yeah, no, so.
And I think conceptually, we said last year, oh my God, we're paying this vast amount of money for power. But we weren't. We were only paying the vast amount of money for the power for the fourth quarter. And even that wasn't as much as we thought it was going to be, because the UARB said to NSP, you can't have the amount you say you want. They only got 7%, I think, instead of 14 or whatever it was. So I think it's in our mind, we thought we were paying a huge amount for wholesale power, but the reality was we were only paying $75 a megawatt hour to New Brunswick for the first 3 quarters. And we were only paying NSP, whatever the municipal rate was plus 7% the final quarter.
So if the deficit that was projected last year, it would have been less by whatever NSPI
Yeah.
didn't increase our rates by relative to what Aaron thought they were going to be when we did the estimate. So there is a difference there in terms of, it should be a little better than we thought, but should it be, $270,000 better than we thought? And I guess that's where actually will
Just looking at like last year's actuals, like right from the audited financial statements, we billed out $2 million in revenue. We had our Q2 audit committee report said we're on track to bill $2.145 million, an increase of 14%, which was consistent with the budget. Then we get these budget documents and said, oh no, we're actually only going to have $1.75 million, a $450,000 variance to the budget, which is a third of the budget. Like in my world, that means like sirens, alert, like what's going on? Why do we have such a negative variance to our revenue budget, our revenue budget? And I'm sure in the full course of time, we'll figure out that these documents, that this revenue is not correct. I hope they're not correct, because how is it possible we billed out $400,000 less this year than we did last year?
And the full course of time should only be our next meeting. I think we're gonna try to get to the bottom of it.
One of the, and this, what I'm gonna say applies to water as well as electricity. But one of the things that makes it very difficult for me is I look at these and I can never tell on any given number whether it's volume or rate. And I can't tell quarter by quarter. So if I could ask two things, really. In my opinion, we should be presenting a budget that's spread quarterly. So we can look at quarterly numbers versus actuals throughout the year. And secondly, we need a column, in my opinion, two columns, one that shows the volume of electricity sold, and the second is the rate it was sold at, which then gives you the total dollars.
Mhm.
All we have now is total dollars. We don't know whether that's rate, volume, or what it is.
So it's the same kind of breakdown we have with assessment. We included the budget showing a breakdown so you can understand if it's new or if it's growth.
Yeah, and the same with water. So we know how many cubic meters we budgeted per quarter. We know what our rate was per cubic meter. You know what the volume, and then we can say, okay, yeah, we didn't sell as much water, because right now we're saying, well, we don't know if we sold as much water as we thought we did, and we don't know why we
We
budgeted.
certainly do have the numbers, so we can.
Yeah, the numbers are there, it's just that we can't see it.
Pick different
So I
columns. in the
think
spreadsheet,
that's-
is that the kind of thing?
I had noted about wanting to find the methodology on water, and I think it's the same thing for electrical, like, I wouldn't necessarily try to put it in the form of a column, because there's most of the items won't really change on that basis,
Yeah.
but to put an intro where we talk about water sold last year and expected water sold this year, like that's pretty straightforward. It would also be a good chance to demonstrate to anybody reading it, the rates haven't changed, so anything going on here is only about projection of sales. I think having a little intro on that, and each, the water and electrical is reasonable in the next version of the budget. I think I can do that.
And
And then the quarterly thing is more of a reporting function. I know Ashley's working on it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
well, it's, I think a common practice in other municipalities to report to council quarterly on the actual results, because it's budgeted quarterly, so it's spread. I'm used to a monthly spreadsheet, but quarterly I could live with. And I think that would be a very helpful subtle newness to our reporting system if we could. If we
You want
had
to
it.
make a motion in that effect
I think we are, I mean,
going
I think
forward?
that's what policy.
well, I think it's just a work in progress for Ashley.
Yeah, I think it's just something for people. to
Okay,
look
Yeah,
at.
what we're talking
You do
about is
something,
not
you do
just doing a
something.
straight line method of doing quarterly allocation of the cost of revenues, like we've always provided a quarterly report, it just uses a straight line method, it says we're one quarter of the way through the year. A
Yeah.
quarter of everything would be expended, that's not great, that's not very helpful, that's not really how it comes in. So it's about actually setting those projections up, so that when we're comparing the quarterly report, we're not just comparing to one quarter of the total expense. We're comparing to, oh, well, we wouldn't have done any plowing in Q1 because that's the spring, so.
Yeah.
That part is just a matter of her putting the numbers into the report, and we just need to do that this year, but I think it's well understood. It was a goal of Luke's, we didn't get there, we'll get there now.
Councillor Owens Crop?
It was similar to Councillor Carver's question, the perception when a citizen looks at our budget. And the question comes to me, is it worthwhile owning our own utility? Is it like when you look at some of these numbers, it's like, are we? And
Let's
I.
say you want to move the monument.
No, never. No, but I think it's perception and having people understand, it's like building the solar garden. Right now, it's a heavy weight for us to carry, but down the road in the future, we should see that turn around and we'll be advance of other municipalities. So for someone looking at these numbers, and this is my first time really looking at the numbers, I know we're better off, I know myself, we're better off for many reasons owning our own utility, but can someone here around the table explain to the general public what this means and why we do it?
Yeah, I think an introduction will go a ways to that. I think there's, can someone here do it almost requires to sit down and go over it with people. I think the solar garden and Eller's house are the easiest ones to explain to people off, as a layperson. Because what you could say is when we build it, we know what the cost of power is going to be.
Mhm.
And we only build it when the cost of power at the time is below what the cost of buying power on the market is. And if anyone's ever had a power bill in their own private life, the cost of power on the market doesn't go down. So if we know we have a fixed cost of production for the next 20-25 years, compared to the market, every year that goes by and rates of market power go up, the benefit to our residents increases. And so like you say, we're building it now. On the solar, our rationale was it'll just break even. Already, we haven't even entered production and market rates have now outstripped what we're likely to be producing power at there. And things in 10 years down the road, that place is still producing power at a predictable rate and market rates have gone up another 30%. It's tremendously beneficial. How we use the benefit, that's where people may not see it in terms of their rates. In the case of Eller's House, the decision was taken to use that benefit to generate a dividend to support other capital improvements in the 3 communities that own the facility. And so it has over the years brought back millions of dollars in investment in recreational and transportation assets and other things in the community. But we need to do a better job of explaining that rather than giving people a slightly lower rate for power, we decided to use that money in another way to benefit the whole community. And I think we're going to have that discussion about what to do with respect to the solar gardens. And there's a strong, value to say, well, it benefits everyone if we take the difference that is generated here between what it costs to produce in the market. And we do use some of that collectively to fund needed infrastructure. And especially since this morning, we've been talking about the struggle where Town General seems to probably have to support infrastructure. Well, that is a source of funds to support that infrastructure going forward. And but people don't notice it. I understand nobody would really know.
So I think with a double check on the revenue lines and the cost of goods sold, to make sure, because in my mind, I'm surprised. I think that there was probably another edit here if I was a betting man. Because I know we were losing money on every kilowatt we sold in the fourth quarter, so it's very difficult to maintain operating margins under that regime. But we did make, it looks to me, a number of decisions to deal with some of the pain of that deficit. We must have pushed the BRD regulatory expense all into next year, all into this fiscal year versus last fiscal year. I know that had been budgeted at a pretty big number, like $40,000, and it doesn't look like we spent that money, but we have a big balloon of close to $100,000 by memory on next year. So this must be just the timing of the payments.
So there was supposed to be, well, originally we were, I think, very, very incorrectly informed. We were looking at $16,000 last year. So that was supposed to be last year's cost. I think what we ended up doing, we say, let's just leave the 16 in last year, and then we budgeted 70 this year, and then the total of those two is where we expect our actual costs to have ended up. But it probably
Fair
should
enough.
have been 50 in last year and 35 in this year instead of 16 in last year and 70 in this year. It just, we had only budgeted 60, so I think that's why it's
Okay.
reflected that way. Yeah.
Okay.
The combination of the 16 and the 70 that's in this year is where we kind of think we're gonna end up. We're
Right.
almost to the end. We
It
just
keeps going
had
up.
more meteor cost last week with the compliance filing.
Yeah, it just
Yeah,
seems to
fair
never end, so.
But these are all, rate recoverable, doesn't make it any better.
Yeah.
Councillor Wilson.
Can I circle back just to the power purchase again for 1 second? And I'm wondering why our area, I'm going back, not this year, but the last year's unaudited
Yeah.
is almost 200 for area.
Mhm.
We bought almost $200,000 less power than budgeted and less than the year before. And yet everything we get from area says everything is running at 99% efficiency and yada, yada, yada.
Mhm.
And we should be getting every electron we can possibly get from.
I mean, we just have to come back with.
Yeah, I'll check with Aaron on that. Yeah. Those are the
I see
numbers.
no reason why it would be different from it was in the last 2 years either. I don't think there's any reason to think it would.
Take a look. and
Like, I'll
see.
bet you the budget number was right. Is my
Yeah,
guess.
yeah. I
The
think there's no
budgeted number is
reason-
probably accurate.
And I mean, it's based
I
on
hope it
what
is,
the
for God's
place
sake.
produces, and we know it produced it, we overproduced expectations, so there's no reason we wouldn't have purchased all of it, so.
Can't recall, I guess maybe we had an unseasonably warm winter, just can't remember, block that out.
Well, we'd always purchase salaries as first thing.
Yeah.
We'd always- I mean, that was, so that should never go down.
Profitability of our friends down the street.
Well, there you go. Okay. So on the operating expenses, Dylan, is there anything, I mean, they all look pretty linear to
There's
the
only one
history
thing I
with
really want to call, well, I guess I'll call attention to
salary
a couple quick
allocation.
things. So supervision salaries is something I think when I'm talking in closed session that was intended once again to be a shot at some notion of how Riverport and Mahone Bay collectively allocate this managerial responsibility. We now know that we're not likely to be buying it from Riverport, so I guess the question is, how are we providing it? I don't think we should cut it for the budget, but I think we'll have the closed session discussion we can talk about, and then we'll come back around and see what we should do. The only other things to significantly note there are the tree removal costs are continuing to climb. We had put them in at 30 last year, we left them at 30 this year. You'll notice the unaudited, we didn't spend all of it. We actually didn't spend all of it. We kept running into challenges, I guess you could say, with the removal, whether that was on the contractor side or residents' concerns or other stuff. So we're still expecting to be at that level with tree removal this year. Well, I should say, maintenance is not all removal, it's limbs,
Where is that
but we're way
line?
behind. Contracted services on redistribution costs on page 70. It just, it was budgeted at 30, we only used, it looks like 8, we're still recommending 30. And I know people might see that and say, well, do we really need 30? So I just want to head it off and say, if anything, we need more than that. We really are still behind in terms of vegetation maintenance after many years of not doing it.
Mhm.
But I think what we came to is we need a higher level of service from the contractors, so we put together a proper tender, and my intention had been working with Nancy to release that with Riverport and Mahone Bay in mind. Now, figure out what form that's gonna take, but I'd still like to get that out and get somebody contract to come and do a round of maintenance in the fall, and I do think we'll need $30,000 for it. We got engineering consultants there. I mean, it says 0, but it wasn't 0, just that everything we consulted with them, we were able to say it was in relation to another project where that project was capitalized. We'd rather capitalize it, or, but if a project doesn't move forward and we've consulted with the engineers, well, that ends up as an operating expense. So, there's a number of things in there that I could, speak to the small variances, but nothing super concerning in that regard. And again, grow load initiatives is similar. Like, we did have some costs incurred, they're just not showing up under unaudited, and whether that is because they really didn't end up needing to be there because they ended up being capitalized, or whether that's because they just were misallocated. I guess that will shake out in their review of the unaudited at the end of the year, because that's often the sort of thing that needs to get picked up at year end as an adjustment if town general took a cost that was supposed to be a utility cost there. But nothing especially notable. The budget to budget is very similar. We've already talked about not doing too much to compare the unaudited to the budget right now. So I think the story of the operating side of the electrical utility is pretty straightforward. Is pretty much a stand pat, where the big question is, where are we getting our energy and what does it cost? And now we've answered that, and I think there's some adjustment that we could make here. We talked about adjusting electrical through the other departments, so I assume that what we would like to do is to actually make some revisions to this one to also reflect the real cost, so that instead of showing revenue that won't come in as revenue, we'll show a deficit, and then we'll show an amount that will be the smoothing intended to cover that deficit, so that it's more transparent in here rather than like what we did in the initial draft, which was just, we didn't know what the board's decision was going to be.
But the revenue and the cost of goods sold should be pretty linear. So let's just say we do have the $285,000 revenue hit based on the smoothing. Fair enough. And then the ongoing kind of the rest of the operating performance of the business and capital. I guess like when you add all the capital, I know we haven't gotten to that part yet. I'm assuming, is the idea that we were going to borrow for that, or are we going to bundle?
Yeah, we just jumped to it now. There's not much, and I can, if that's okay.
No.
Before we do that, Mr. Curious about the vehicle expense. I know we budgeted highly, but we didn't spend much of it, and why is it still high?
Yeah, I think that probably Ashley might have some notes, but there was This is maybe a little bit of the Riverport to Home Bay where the vehicles were and.
Yeah,
See what you've got on that line.
Yeah, no, so what I was, when I discussed it with the RELC manager at the time, it was based on an increased cost in the gas, plus insurance and cyber insurance, all in that.
But why we thought we would spend it last year and didn't, and did we actually not spend it and why? I think there's probably a little bit of narrative.
Yeah, I can look into it. Unfortunately, it's a little harder to track down answers without someone to ask, on that side, but let me take a look and see if.
I mean, to some extent, we obviously thought we overcorrected because we brought it back down to 23, but there's a little bit of missing information there. And normally the managers do play a lot of role in these operational estimates. Of course, that Nancy did play that role in this case.
Yeah, I usually try to talk to all the managers in all the departments and get their idea and concept of what needs to be done for the year. Obviously, they have a better idea than I. So there's usually an intricate role between me and them when I'm doing this,
Councillor Wilson.
but I will look.
Just one more question on power purchase. The NSPI number.
Yeah.
Does that, the rate from NSPI, is that the old number that we're dealing with or the new 7% number?
With their UARD increase.
Yes.
When the spreadsheet was done on the area side, that would have been their old number.
So that 1.5 million is actually something considered, for the first 3 quarters of the year will be something considerably less.
Yes.
Backup top up.
No, that would be, there's no
We don't
backup
have
top
any
up that
backup
we're
top up.
buying from them.
Oh, going forward, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was looking.
I'm looking at the 1.5
Oh,
for
yeah,
this
yeah,
year.
yeah, fair enough.
It's the first 3 quarters is
Yeah.
7% increase instead of 14.9 or whatever it was.
Yeah.
So that will help us a bit with that 2 point, whatever million deficit.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, so what we'll
NSPI's
do is the
increase.
new version will do it based on the actual rates now that they've been struck. And then the resulting deficit number will be shown as a cover from another source, but the amount of that number may change, as you say, as we shake out the new.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
but is it possible under cost of goods sold to break out, like our historical run rate on NSP the last 2 years? It's a misnomer. It's not really power purchase. Those are just top up backup, right?
Yeah, I mean,
So-
occasionally there is power purchase. under backup.
I'm just saying like for the year that ended in March 31st, the 640,000. That was more like 275 top up backup and the gap, the rest of it was power purchase.
Well, yeah, because the prior year actual 260,
I'm just
that
thinking
was,
like-
that was pretty much just back.
Like, down the road, as we talk about the bringing on the solar garden and displacing power, I think it would have, there's a virtue in splitting that out. Top up backup versus the
Yeah, now
power.
that we're actually purchasing from NSPI, having backup top up show is a different line.
Right. I mean, I think that has value to show that we're deloading from NSP over time, if that's the case. Where the obvious question we have every year about the truck financing with Riverport, the $36,000, are we expensing that? Is that lease of the truck from Riverport, which I always historically thought was our truck that we were lending to them and we were getting revenue. At least that's the way the financials were structured several years ago, but now apparently they own the truck and we're paying them for it, which is fair enough if that's the case. But where is that expense? Where do we see that?
I think we own the truck and they're paying us on an annual basis.
This is the truck, the Alltech truck that we bought 3 years ago.
The one that well, anyway, there's an arrangement with Riverport and somebody sends someone a check. Do we?
So at the time, when we bought the truck, we bought the truck outright and we own the truck.
Okay,
What we had an agreement with Riverport to do was that they were going to cover half of the cost of that truck.
okay,
And they couldn't do that, so they wanted to borrow the cost. And so we came up with a schedule of what the borrowing would be.
Yeah, fair enough.
The truck,
yeah,
and that they would pay us, so when you say what's their payment, it's their prorated annual share of
Piece of-
their 50%.
piece of the financing
Yeah,
of the original debt, fair enough, but is that?
so where does it show up? That question's for Ashley.
Does that payment just go into the equipment reserve directly, or does it come into general revenue somewhere? Anyway, it's an outstanding question, just take it away.
Yeah, I know you've asked it before, I'm not sure if Ashley's, do you have a quick answer, or do you want to take it away?
URB seemed.
Let me take it away.
Like the URB document said it was their truck, that's the only question, the reason I'm
Yeah.
asking.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Councillor Wilson.
Because there are two trucks in question.
The other truck is their truck,
It's whose?
is Riverport.
Yeah, with the one that they bought without consulting us,
That's
back
right.
7 years ago. And we had to pay for it because they had no money and lease it back to them, their half, correct? That happened about 7 years ago.
Yeah, well, it was before my time. It's
So I
my
presume those
understanding-
payments are still in there too.
That I'm not sure, because I'm not, that was before my time as well. I feel like that's.
Maybe we should get a do a review on the truck, both trucks,
You should go count at the very
and
least.
get a document out that tells us. who
Like in
owns what.
in a perfect world, this would move, in a perfect world, if there are any payments, it would be preferable to have the payments going into the equipment reserve. But that if they don't, as long as they show up, not a hill to die on, if they are showing up.
If it is just netting something in the background, as we often have done in terms of the way this reporting shows our report, is we just show the net rather than we show the cash flows back and forth, so it may be one of
I
those.
guess the
Oh, yeah,
the
good.
takeaway is that up until 2 years ago, we always reported the Riverport payment as a revenue line, and then it just sort of vanished last year. But I mean, you can only report on what you see in the numbers, so just always curious about that number. Anyway, other than that,
Perfect.
Other than the fact we don't know which trucks we own.
Yeah.
We do know.
And get it. Other than that, we're okay.
On a serious note, I think that based on those questions being raised, I think that's something that we need to clarify.
yeah,
And if it's through this budget process, or maybe at some point, that clarification needs to be there.
Yeah, probably just an email in the next little while before we finalize the budget, so.
We will get to the bottom of it and we'll all know and never have to talk about it again.
I'm waiting to be acknowledged by the mayor.
I'm just making a note.
Thank you. It's hard enough for me to understand our relationship with Riverport, and I can't imagine what a member of the public makes of it. And is this something that we might consider doing a storyboard or an infographic? I don't know. How do we interpret this to the public, our relationship with Riverport?
So, I mean, I'm occasionally asked to comment. I think we put it in writing in a few different reports and things over the past number of years, but I mean, essentially, we have an operational partnership. So we have an agreement that specifies that we share the costs associated with the PLTs and we share the costs associated with the trucks. It is almost a 50-50 share, with the exception of one of the pieces of equipment being like 55-45 or something. I don't know if Ashley, there's one not 50-50 thing, but the rest of it is basically it's 50-50 share. As relates to the operation of the trucks, fuel, the line crew. That's what we can easily say we do. We share that 50-50. As to, you know, what this means in terms of a benefit, I mean, it's very evident that what it means is that we need the crew to cover, you know, in terms of having standby coverage. When we have an outage, it's rare that we have an outage in both communities, so all of the resources can be brought to bear as needed in the community in which the outage occurs. So, you know, the service to residents is much stronger than we could do if we had to pay 100% of it. And that's really the strong rationale. In terms of would we put out an agreement and say, like, here's the actual underlying agreement to, I mean, unfortunately, what we have in terms of agreements, as we've all acknowledged significantly over the past couple of years, it needs work. It does need work. Like we're making do with what we have, but it could be expressed in a much more coherent way. And I think everybody around our table would like to work on that.
And which council has instructed, sort of, not instructed, but basically laid it out that that's where we want to go strategically with it.
Yeah.
Hopefully they come to the table and
So the details are a work in progress.
Yeah, and it is caught up as well, and Aaron had come and presented to council recently, so if anybody's watching this who wants to look back on that presentation, it caught up in a larger changing picture for all of the municipal utilities where we need more capacity in some areas, we need to find creative ways to share in order to keep costs down for residents, and it may be that includes sharing with more than just Riverport, and that may be where this, you know, discussion goes as a larger structure to share resources with some other utilities that we work with, so, yeah.
Well, if we have an opportunity to provide some public information or information to the public on the parts that we know and also the work in progress aspect. I think that might be useful. It's not a motion, it's just.
So that's the operating. I said I could jump over to capital. People had a couple of questions, so we didn't yet, but I think it's a very quick jump over there if we're going to. So electrical capital begins on page 109. And it's just 9 items, so I'll go through them. And they're mostly these standing items that are in here every year. So electric line replacements is a standard thing in there. We've continued to budget for it. It doesn't always come in at 25,000. It's usually less, but it is when needed. We identify needs. Digital electric meters is similarly as needed to support development. There's a planned turnover of meters, but mostly it's just when there's new customer counts. Transformers here, this was always in here as a standard replacement of transformers, but this year it is combined with the PCB transformers replacement project, which is the next item. Together they're 120. Council recently on the sidelines of this budget process approved the change there. We didn't reflect that in this version. I'd like everyone's permission to reflect it in the next version. And that was essentially consolidating the transformers projects this year and next year into one $400,000 project. So rather than showing it as 20,000, 100,000, 20,000, 150,000, we're going to show it as 400,000 in this year, with the understanding that the costs will be incurred over the course of 2 years, and then that this will be from borrowing, and it is shown as from borrowing here. So that's just the difference in practice how we actually obtain the transformers, but that's the same effort. Thermal imager and underground locator, again, that was the shared pieces of equipment. New street lights as needed, so that's just replacement of lights if they don't work. Voltage regulator, council's familiar with this based on growing demand in our system, especially on the extremities of the system. Last year we ordered some voltage regulators to be installed, and they are due next month, and we're looking forward to getting them put in. So that remains in here because it's still a project that was carried over from last year. We haven't actually got them yet. And the utility, so we're not buying more. This is not more, this is the same ones. And the utility truck is a recommendation here around the replacement of the existing truck. I'm not sure why the description is looking. I'm not sure what happened there. So this truck is going to be, you know, to the conversation we just had, another discussion with a report about can we collectively afford to replace the existing. This is the running around truck. This is not the pole setting trucks. This is they have a third truck, which is just a pickup, you know, and replacement of that pickup. And it should be split notionally. That's what we would assume. But before we would be able to proceed with anything in this area, Riverport would have to put in writing that they had committed to making payments, and how we want to do that, I'm not sure. In our case, we did put it down for borrowing. If we collectively borrow and share the cost, that's one way we could approach it. But as I said, with water, the crux of this is on the following page 112, where it says capital reserve, MFC borrowing, electric operating funds and external sources. And so what we've got there is Riverport's the external source, basically, for those shared items. Capital reserve is taking the largest part of the hit because we don't have operating surplus, because we were projected to, and Ash was working on the unaudited, have left ourselves with very little in the operating surplus at the end of 2022-23 because of the rates not being in place. And so as a result, we would have to look to borrowing for the transformers and the truck are the two projects. And now that we know the transformers are $400,000 over 2 years, I think it's obvious that we would do borrowing for that. And if we want to talk about whether at the end of the day, if we're buying a truck and paying for half of the truck, and if we can afford our half and Riverport can't afford theirs or whatever, but that will certainly come to council in the form of a draft agreement with Riverport before we would move to actually buy anything. So does anyone have any questions about that?
Councillor, no.
Just one question going back to the replacement of the transformers. We're saying 400,000 over 2 years. Is it a benefit to put in that 400,000 in this year's budget and then paying it over 2 years, or should it be put into the 2-year budget?
The benefit of putting it in this year is that we actually have to sign a contract for which I need council's authorization anyway, so that's why we ended up doing it that way. because the contract will be to deliver them over the 2 years, but upfront, I need council's authority to make the commitment to pay for it, so.
Yeah.
That's where we said we gotta put in the first year, because the contract will be let the first year, but then the costs are incurred, similar to the fire truck, the costs are incurred over time.
Stepping there.
Just a reminder that we did discuss that piece.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
great detail and approved it. I
Yeah.
think, yeah.
So it's just a matter of Ashley and I reflecting in the updated next final version of the budget that will.
Yeah.
Will show that change.
So just to go back to the truck for a second, what happens if council decides to contribute our $40,000 for a running around truck? And Riverport says, no, we haven't got it. Do we buy the whole truck and then let them use half of it?
Yeah, I mean, we can look at, would we make an arrangement to lease but I think at the end of the day, it's down to, we're tolerating the truck needing at a certain point and then life to be replaced. If we don't replace it, they're on the hook to pay for the operating costs that are split, but that there's a certain point at which keeping it in use isn't justifiable. And if their share of the operating costs exceed their share of whatever the principal or interest or lease payments or whatever, I mean, it would be a logical thing for them to agree. But again, if they don't agree and it really came down to it, it's hypothetical. I don't think we should get into a whole lot right now.
Counselor
So
Allen?
how old is that truck and does it actually need replacing this year?
So the staff believe it does strongly, as to how old the truck is.
Is that
In
the
the
used?
draft versions of this, when Jonathan and people usually put the number in,
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's
We
what
just had
Derek
this from Crystal, I bet that would show
second
the age.
is, right? Isn't that the little gray truck that Derek,
No.
or black truck that Derek had?
No, it is a little run around truck, but it's an electrical utility one that has the
Is it?
electric logo on
Yeah,
it.
it's a white F-150.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
I think it's an F-150. We just had a list of the.
When you wonder if there's a virtue in kind of having a fleet management contract between the two organizations, and we bundle in the historical, like the trucks and the payments back and forth and the one truck, and whatever the methodology is, just put it all in one schedule of equipment
Mhm.
and with one new contract back and forth and one, instead of trying to relitigate the historical. I mean, I think some of those old deals do have contracts. Like there is a contract and a schedule of payments. So,
Yeah.
and I mean, if it's not being adhered to, and maybe it is being adhered to, but if it's not, this is an opportunity to kind of clean all those things up.
Mhm.
It's really very cumbersome the way it's structured now, like even with every piece of equipment having a separate, like we invoice each other back and forth for, hundreds of things throughout the year, like it really is very cumbersome.
The key is when we borrow to buy a capital item that has a 10-year life, we shouldn't be taking the shared services payments back as revenue. That those shared services payments should either be going to pay down the debt, pay down the loan, or they should be going back into the equipment reserve. So as long as we can be assured that we've got the right buckets paying for the right things. I mean, it costs a lot of money to run the utility. This $80,000 truck compares to the $95,000 truck we just bought last week. I'm assuming this is a fair price.
Mahone
because-
Bay is still 1 square mile big, isn't it?
Well, I mean, different functions, we're doing them, using the trucks for different things.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I mean, I'm just saying, is the $80,000 budget? Is this truck material? If we're gonna do it, like, let's make sure the budget aligns with reality, because last week we just bought a truck for 95,000. I'm assuming this is a similar truck,
That truck is a 2019.
the one we just bought.
No, the Ford truck that we have right now.
The one to
No,
replace.
that's the Altec, it's the 2019.
Hold on,
Where did you find it?
I asked Crystal.
Oh, scheduled vehicles, Mahone Bay, here we go. This is what I was looking for.
Anyway, no surprise at $300,000 annually for the utility. This is sort of in keeping with our historical capital amount.
Mhm.
The problem is that the utility doesn't make, like, we're always running negative cash flow. And I worry, even with the increased power rates, what we aren't seeing is we're not, and maybe we'll see this next year, but we're still just not seeing enough money to cover off Like, we're perpetually negative cash flow in the utility. And so we have to keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing and borrowing to fund the capital. And this isn't even including the full load of transformers. Because we'll have another, only doing 100 of the 400 this year, right?
So we had it down as doing 100, like you mean what will we incur this year?
The cash.
Yeah,
we
cash
incurred
flow is
more,
30% to 400,000 will be what we would incur this year.
And then another,
And then the remaining
3/4
70% of 400,000 would be next year.
just saying, like, so we got the utility that is very low debt, like there's very little debt in the utility. And now, but we're incurring quite a bit of debt in the utility, which is all cost recoverable through the rate. But it's gonna be a couple of years before we'll go back for a rate increase. I'm just wondering if we're talking about the town lending the utility money to cover off the smoothing. I just wonder about, we're really talking about the utility absorbing substantial debt in the next 2
So
years.
it's a good point, is that we worry about the utility absorbing debt for operating versus what do we care about the utility absorbing debt for capital? But I guess, we should also stress that the smoothing of the operating is meant to be a payback within
Short of
like
it.
2-3 years.
Yeah, fair enough.
Whereas in this case, if we're buying the transformers, they're good for more than 20 years. The transformers we've got in service that are being replaced by these transformers were installed prior to 1980.
I'm just
That's why they're
wondering,
being replaced.
Yeah.
So, yeah, just to give you a sense of the useful life of transformers, if we borrow this 400 over 20 years even, we would easily, those would still be in service. I mean, 90% of them would still be in service. So, but I mean, it's a good point, like overall, the strategy within the utility about borrowing versus self-financing and.
Mhm. Like, do we have any idea where municipal finance corp interest rates are? Like, the market's saying interest rates are inevitably gonna peak and go down.
Yeah,
So, I mean,
there may be a value to not getting in on the fall debenture to the, yeah. I mean, these are all good questions. I think we'll just have to
Anyway.
discuss them as the year goes on. Did you get an answer? Cause I'm like, when I'm looking at this list, like we've got a 2011 and 2000 and.
Yeah, no, it's a little, I think a schedule will be appropriate, because apparently we own the Altech
Yeah, that's.
2019, and then Riverport owns the other two. But the newest one that we purchased, they own it, but we're financing it, so I think there just needs to be a schedule and lay it out for you guys.
Come on down to all this Dylan's used truck lot.
So let me put something together for you guys, so we can actually just nail it down. This is a little,
Well, yeah, this is spreadsheet of all the equipment, but it's missing which
This is
department it
all
belongs in, so.
yeah,
So I'm looking at it, I can't tell which one's in which department from this sheet. So that was electrical capital, and I see we're kind of taking a break maybe, because some people get up, and I'd love to get to the washroom, can we?
We're on break.
Fair enough.
Maybe just call it a 5-minute break, I know we're still on camera, so just.
I'm the deputy, mayor's deputy, so.
Be aware we're not muted, yeah, thank you. Be aware we're not muted.
Never muted. Oh.
Asset management crisis.
You have too many assets. You have too many assets. One of the funniest things was in the back of the day, of course, we had a thing. I drove around down this back and trying to. Saw that would see a board. All day. And a month ago, I was actually on my bike, by the pickup guy, the stuff is there. And then I bike by it again at Joanne's Market. Oh, we've got food. And the pickup guy.
So now let's talk about who owns the town hall building.
And the garage, I got.
Huh?
For the garage. I got.
We're not on mute.
See my note on here.
Recent?
I just sent it.
Oh, that's what I was in.
Oh, that, caught that last cup of coffee out of that pot, I'll tell you. We'll stand right up in it.
Yum, yum.
I guess the point is it's still using 60, not the 90.
Oh, Christ. That's the letter, right? I got your email, but I don't see there any text.
It's just
We're not on mute, hey, Penny?
just the description and
We're
the
not on mute?
subject line.
Well, that's it?
That's the message.
Oh, on the V12 version, I see what you mean.
This doesn't matter with it, but she wants to donate.
Oh,
Who should she contact?
Dylan or Kelly?
Oh, she's not at the town hall, they told me they didn't know.
Oh, well, I would,
Bill,
I would pass that information along to Dylan and then
Okay.
he can
all right,
channel it as appropriate. The point being that the front desk doesn't seem to know about. the
no,
pension
they
of
don't
the
know
program.
yet what the detail is. Citizen was inquiring about contributing a bench.
Hmm.
And when she called the town hall downstairs, staff were not aware as to what the procedure was.
Okay, I know Kelly has talked to them, but it may have been that it was, you know, kind of the third string person who answered the phone, so. Sue may know about it, but Crystal may
Okay.
not, for example,
Alright.
as well.
So it's an aside too, today is Kelly's birthday.
Yeah.
Shall we have cake?
Very
Let
good.
them use it.
Ooh,
Right, no, I agree.
And Crystal's last day is Friday or the next Friday?
Next.
Next Mark.
Next Friday.
so what are we on next now?
So I think we're gonna go into the closed session. I would, before that, I would take just a second to recap what the takeaways for Ashley and I have been so that we can maybe be
Okay.
prepared not to spend time after the closed session on that. But
Mayor, I saw
it's
you-
fresh now.
Were you having a discussion with Betty on Tuesday?
Just remember, we're still,
Yeah,
just remember, we're still live. Suzanne.
yeah, having a chat with a couple of people and there's some issues.
Well, we had wine on Wednesday.
Yeah.
With the loom.
Post office for an hour, I think. Kathy? Julie's in Victoria, so,
So you're footloose and fancy food.
well,
So as you were up at Wine Wednesday.
no, I don't think.
Can you do loom column?
Yes, yeah. Yes, indeed, he was commenting, I couldn't see the city of Calgary for the smoke when she flew in
Oh, yeah.
on Tuesday,
Yes, we're pretty good at it though.
yeah.
It's not, this, you know, it's pretty flat.
Back. Sorry, we were discussing trucks down there.
Excellent.
I want to pick up too.
Will anybody admit to owning it or what?
Well, to be continued.
Mayor, I know this is a public meeting. We've had a lot of discussions around the power rates. I'm wondering what our plan is to publicly disclose that. I'm not sure if the URB ruling has been fully communicated to the town at large, but we probably should do that. It's before the YouTube video gets posted. Or I guess in tandem with the YouTube video getting posted. So this public information gets communicated.
So we have,
Public.
Even live, so.
And live, so I mean, it's
we have
facts on the
a
ground.
regular meeting next Thursday, and the first bills that will go out reflective of the rates will follow that. So what I was going to suggest to David in terms of the draft agenda, when we talk about that here today and tomorrow, so would be that we have an item on the agenda for a press release like we have done.
Okay.
And that in advance of the meeting that be circulated and vetted, and we're comfortable with it. But basically, it'll be updating the press release we issued last October when we said we're going to apply, and now saying a decision has been reached. And for people to expect to see those rates effective through the year. So, yeah, we'll prepare that, and then if that's suitable, I'd let a council item on the agenda to say officially acknowledging, and, you know, this is the decision.
And will we be describing to the members of the public the steps on smoothing that council is
Well,
taking?
so,
Will
I
it be
mean,
clear to them that town hall is gonna be applying some smoothing techniques to.
it'll be clear that the rates are taking effect differentially, so there's a rate taking effect now and another one January 1st. I don't know how much we would normally like want to go into the idea that the 20% was, you know, being permitted, and that the difference between the 20% and the effective rate January 1st was something that we were pushing forward into the future. Like I guess would get council's
Okay.
pulse on that now. I'll be doing a draft of it. If you
Yeah.
feel strongly that we should detail that in the draft, or you can wait and see what I do, and then, you know. There's a certain amount of information that may be too technical for people, like where that smoothing funds are coming from. That may not be relevant, I don't know.
Anyway,
I might have missed a beat there. So some information will be going out via a press release. And will we be having an insert or information included in the power bills? That sort of will definitely reach every customer. Press release might not reach every customer, and it's having a message in the power bills is a little more personal, and I think it might be.
I think we could probably get like a sentence in the power bills, like if we don't have a lot of room to work with.
Well, we used to put little strips in for fundraisers all the time, you know,
Just on a separate
so
sheet.
we could have a separate.
So sorry, I wasn't here when this conversation started. Are we talking about explaining the rate increases?
Yeah.
So, yeah, we were planning on adding some form of communication in the bill to kind of explain the percentage and how it's affecting, and yeah, we were planning on doing something like
But I
that.
think it's on, you can add it to the same document, right? It's right on the,
To the bill?
yeah,
Um,
or are you gonna put an insert?
I was gonna put an insert
make it
in.
a separate.
And
Yeah, that
we
was
stop
probably
it
it.
ourselves, so.
Yeah, to just put an insert in with it.
I think it's a big enough issue and a serious enough concern to
Yeah.
people that we should give it as much attention as we possibly can.
Both in consideration.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, anybody that's listening is more than welcome to give me a call, and I can certainly go through it with them as well, so we can, aside from the letter.
I'd like to see a press release from the town hall saying that the town has successfully navigated the NSRB utility review board process. The regulator has provided a ruling, and we're implementing it as per their directions. And I think that because this isn't just about the rate, this is about like, there was a lot of pain and suffering associated with achieving the rate. There was a lot of investment and regulatory expertise to achieve the rate. Like the fact, and we haven't gone back for a rate increase in 8 years. And so I think that we should disclose that this has occurred. And we should do that sooner rather than later. I mean, it's bad news in the sense of the rate is the rate, and the rate is a lot higher than the old rate, fair enough. But it's also an accomplishment in the fact that this is the cost of doing business, and the town had to incur a lot of staff time, energy, and money to achieve it. And if you look at other communities who've not yet started that process yet, like Lunenburg, it's a milestone that I think needs to be communicated. Do you think we could also have a motion, I'm happy to make it, that council directs staff to craft a report on the potential use of the perpetual care funds to be provided as a loan to the utility to facilitate the operational deficit in 2023-24.
Good motion. Do we have a seconder? Councillor Longstreth seconds. That is the action that arises from what we've been discussing for the last hour. On the question? All in favor? Motion's carried. Thank you for that, Councilor Creedy. Remembering that.
So,
Mr. Hyde, is there anything else before we entertain a motion to go in camera?
so I wanted to kind of recap we've now received, I think, enough direction to produce another revision of the budget, which is great. I would think it's probably the close to final version at this point. So I just had a question in terms of that revision, because when we were doing this revision, I left a deficit. We talked, or left a surplus rather. We talked about, there's a number. Normally, that's not the practice, right? Normally, when we present what is the final version, it's a zero balance. So I'm wondering if the perspective in terms of like whatever shakes out, should I be trying to take more capital that was reserve and move it into capital or revenue to use up? Because the reason we created that room was for that reason, right? So should we do that? Should we leave it showing an amount? I do feel it's necessary to caution council that one of the largest items we removed in our initial effort to reduce the operating lines was the additional expected cost for noise bylaw enforcement. Council has since proceeded with noise bylaw development. I believe we're getting a lot of interest from the community in it. And I strongly do believe we've under budgeted the necessary enforcement costs. So I'm just wondering how we might want to approach, now that there is going to be some left in there, right? It's roughly 40,000 that's presented in this version. And then as we readjust the electrical impacts on general, some of that will shake out too. So like, let's say it's $50,000. If we would recommend putting half of that back into the operating budget, should we? If we would recommend taking some of it out of capital, like how do we, like, should I just come with a recommendation that zero balances it, or how does council want to provide direction on that?
Just one thing while we've gone back to capital, there's one item that I'm really concerned of, that's the repaving of the parking lot off of Perry Street. I've been looking at it, and I know you had said that we were doing it because we're gonna do lines, but I think if we do the lines now, that paving could wait for another couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, when we discussed with Jonathan, he said it
Take the
could.
paving part out of that.
Yeah, we discussed with Jonathan, we said it could wait, so it was really just that no direction was provided to move it, but if council felt that we should, we can move it now.
Okay, a motion,
To move the paving part of that parking lot out of the budget.
do we have a seconder? Councilor
Seconder.
Carver? Councilor Carver, did you want to comment on the question as well?
No, I had another.
Another issue?
Yeah.
Okay. You've heard the motion to defer that paving of the Parish Street parking lot to next year, possibly the year after. All in favor? Motion's carried. Now, Councilor Carver.
Yes, I'm glad the CAO raised the issue of the bylaw officer additional time. Again, I personally would like to see that back in the budget. I'd be happy to see the 50,000 back in the budget for that particular function. I don't know if I want to make a motion to that effect, or to sort of get a sense of around the room. What are the pros and cons of that? I would be interested to hear how have it in the budget and have staff come back and with some ways to make that work. And I will make a motion. My belief in this issue is coming out stronger. To make the motion at $50,000.
That wasn't the original amount, just maybe,
Yeah.
sorry.
Oh, okay.
Maybe
Come
you
back
could
with a
say-
report. Okay.
maybe you could say just that staff include additional funds for bylaw enforcement in the draft 2023-24.
Thank you. Thank you for walking me back.
Because we never recommended 50, yeah, so I didn't want.
Okay, that staff provide a report, what the CAO just said.
Just, we've always done, just revise the draft budget to reflect, so.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's
Do
a
we have a
motion.
seconder?
I'll second on the question.
And on the question?
Yeah, so I'm wondering why that is a motion.
So I was looking for more of a general direction. I didn't specifically need a motion.
Okay.
Again, we've done other things by motion. I don't think it's inappropriate. But essentially, if the motion were to pass, I'd still be saying, well, okay, so that's part of the probable surplus. So, do I have discretion to recommend the use of the remainder? And if this motion were to fail, I'd still be asking, what does council want to give me any direction about zero balancing? And, or do I just use discretion? I would prefer to present a zero balance budget, I guess is my.
And that's, I'm hesitant about the motion in the sense that I would rather that we did not have it is a pass or fail on that perspective, that we actually discussed and agreed, well, put it in and then we'll discuss it as a final budget, as opposed to a motion now, which means now we're agreeing on that amount. That doesn't give us an opportunity to.
Well, no, it's still just, I should clarify, it's still just a motion to revise the draft, so we would still have to vote on the draft, but.
Councillor
It still
Noel.
doesn't have to be voted.
My question on that is, when we took it out of the budget, did we do that by motion or we just do that by suggestion?
No, so what staff were asked to do is come back with suggested reductions in the budget in order to achieve some space for capital and revenue. We were not prescribed certain things, so we didn't have a motion on it before.
There was no motion to take it out. Okay.
And so similarly now, if I got like big picture direction, use my discretion to put things back in or whatever, as long as it comes to a zero balance. I don't need a motion, but the motion won't change that, it just ties my hands all.
The reason I asked that is that if we made a motion to take it out, then we probably need a motion to put it back in. If we didn't, then we probably don't need that motion to put it back in.
I would just say it's not harmful, but it's not necessary. I guess it's weird.
Deputy Mayor?
So I'd rather as council just give CAO discretion to come back. Rather than us putting motion that particular item.
Discretion to.
To come back either with we're calling it a zeroized.
Yeah, it'll either be going to reserve, covering an expenditure, or paying for capital and a revenue. I'll recommend one of those, and then you guys can
Yeah.
discuss if you think I did a good job.
Excuse me, I'm just not following how the bylaw officer additional time gets factored into that.
He makes the discretion of where he puts the money.
So if I've said that if given the opportunity, I would recommend putting some more allocation on bylaw enforcement. So if council just says, bring us a budget with your recommendations, I'm saying I would do that, but if I was directed to do it by motion, I would also do it, so.
Councillor Meany?
So that initial exercise reduced all kinds of items, not just bylaws, right? And there were, we eliminated all the tree work for the cemeteries, for example. There were a number of cuts that were made to this. So, I wasn't comfortable with the full allocation as per the original budget, because we hadn't even implemented the bylaw yet, and we're not going to finalize that until the end of this month. So, and I know there's a conversation about the virtues of the moral suasion driven by the bylaw versus the requirement for enforcement. And although I take the CAO's recommendation there, so I don't know. I'm okay if you want to add another allocation. We'll have another kick at the can, not a hill to die on this morning, but there's lots of things that we're leaving off the priority list. I just don't know if the full amount is part of the affordability.
So then at least one item, not everything else that we've eliminated.
But so that's where, if I had discretion, I guess what I'm saying is if it all shakes out that there's $50,000 in there. And it makes sense to me to say, okay, I'm just gonna move 3 items from capital revenue that are worth 15,000 to 35 left. Let's go back and put 15 in bylaw, 10 back into the trees. Let's put back a couple of things we took out in order to get to zero. I'm just looking at like, should I bring a version that recommends that?
Yes, because the decision has to be made at this table.
Oh, of course it'll come here anyway,
Okay.
but if you don't want to tell me all the changes, I'll just propose changes. And then we'll still discuss it. Yeah. So just so that I know what to do to prepare a draft.
Just out of curiosity, does the bylaw enforcement officer issue summary offense tickets for around the noise bylaw if there are infractions?
If we had a noise bylaw and the summary offenses were registered with the province, yes, they would do that, yeah.
Is that your intention?
Well, I believe council is going in the direction of establishing a bylaw with summary offenses. I would like to have the ability to know that if we had a complaint, we had the capacity to go out and respond and issue a
And
ticket.
where does the money go that is received from the summary offense ticket? And I'm only asking because, does it come to the town, or does some of it go to the province, or?
It comes to the town, I don't know if the province takes something off the top, if they collect it, Kelly's nodding, some amount if they. collect it.
Well, we establish an amount and the province adds a fee on top of that.
Okay.
And
Okay.
So what the person pays goes to both, but what we have as a fine comes to us.
yeah,
And
I mean,
it
it wouldn't
comes
be
in
a
as
substantial, not
general-
a substantial
Yeah, we have a small line.
stream of
of
income or
general
anything like
revenue
that.
on, you know, fees and fines and whatever, and it's not a lot of revenue.
But ostensibly, once we
Not that major.
define the content of the noise bylaw, one would hope that citizen pressure would get most people, right, reasonable people to follow it.
One would hope, I think we talked about it extensively on prior occasions.
Yeah. Okay, Deputy Mayor, comment?
No, so it was just.
Because we still have
Yeah,
the,
we need to decide on the motion.
yeah,
And we need to go to closed session before 12.
And this is the last thing, and then we'll do that, so, yeah.
So
what's,
if you-
it's at 12 o'clock, Deputy Mayor.
that's the time the meeting ends.
Okay,
Lunch starts.
we do have a motion on the floor.
Yes, so I made the motion, and does this, is it going to be more effective to leave the motion as it is or to withdraw the motion? That I'm totally confused at this point.
Well, it's,
I mean, it seems that the consensus here is that people would favor me bringing a version of the budget with recommendations to achieve a zero balance. And if that's the case, I would say the motion is not necessary. If there's gonna be any subsequent to this motion being voted on, pushback on that other concept, you might regret having withdrawn your motion. So I can't speak to the other members around the table, but nobody has yet raised any suggestion other than that I bring back a recommended zero balance budget, so.
Well, okay, so it may be a zero balance budget, but we're drawing down, as per page 17, we're drawing down $900,000 out of the reserve balances. We're borrowing an immense amount of cash. Plus, we're running a flat budget or a non-operating surplus. So, like, I guess we can sprinkle around the edges here on $15,000 or $20,000 for the bylaw officer and $5,000 for the tree trimming. But I mean, we are drawing down a third of our reserves and we're borrowing as much money as we've ever borrowed ever before. And just think we need some context about where the reserve balances need to be. So going back to the original conversation about the province has expectations about our reserve balances where they are, as long as we update page 17, Ashley's page 17, to reflect a ending year reserve balance that's sufficient to meet our minimum requirements from the province for a strong FIR, then we can spend the balance budget, Dylan. Like, I'm okay with it. I just don't want to spend the balance budget. I don't have a 30% increase in revenue based on a big tax, a big assessment increase, spend it all and burn $1.5 million to the reserve and still not meet the province's minimum expectations. So as long as we kind of know where we're going to be as far as the province's requirements, then I'm okay having a balanced budget versus having an operating surplus. But I would have thought in the last couple of years, our desire was to build our reserve balances on page 17 versus this budget proposal has us burning down the reserve balance by $900,000. So this is a change of, and it's timing and
It's a $900,000 burn down, Council Feeney.
it gets us things. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying they're not there. I'm not saying they're poor investments. I'm all for them. All I'm suggesting is it's not clear. It's not clear to me that when we illustrate that we're at $1.5 million, when we end the year $1 million lower on the reserves, how does that impact our FIR? And as long as we're good to go on that, like, I'm okay.
Okay.
I know that there has been some policy changes in the province, Dylan, that you mentioned before. I'm certainly no expert on them, but if you think that the reserve balances will end the year sufficiently high enough to meet our obligations and promises to the province, then I'm okay.
Yeah, I get that, that's an easy thing to check on, like in
Yeah.
terms of what I recommend that we try to stick out with an operating balance of $150,000, no. I like the
You'd rather
operating
have
reserve
it
should,
higher.
should be higher than that.
Yeah,
But the province is no longer looking at the distinction, and our overall reserve balances should, and Ashley can confirm, but I think they will meet those required levels. I think what we need to look at is, you know, in going forward with the reserve policy, do we establish anything as a way of ensuring the operating reserve has a goal or fund, you know?
yeah,
That's the reserve policy, I think. We've done a good job of running surpluses every year, and those surpluses do accrue to that fund, but then we've also been spending them. So, you know, are we working towards a target or just making ends meet year to year? I think the reserve policy is where we should focus on establishing that target. But in terms of, you know, I take your point this year, like if I had $50,000 to work with and I said, well, let's do 25,000 as a transferred operating reserve, a projected surplus is the same thing. It's a transferred operating reserve. I mean, it's a drop in the bucket here. And at the end of the day, any surplus will go there. So it's a matter of, let's say the hypothetical of bylaw enforcement, and I'm not gonna go down too much of a rabbit hole, but let's say we put $25,000 on bylaw enforcement. And then when the conversation comes along, we decide we're not really going to need it, and at the end of the year, like lo and behold, we only spent $4,000 on Al coming out for a few after hours calls, and that's what happened. The 21,000 still ends up as surplus, which still ends up as a transferred operating reserve. So
Mhm.
I think we just need, the goals need to be established by policy, and then actually we'll craft future years' budgets to support that. But in terms of this year, we'll run the financial condition indicator on reserve levels and make sure we're not doing something that would look bad.
Councillor
So,
Carter.
so on the basis of the discussion that I've heard and with the permission of the seconder of the motion, I'd like to withdraw the motion and trust that the CAO will deal with the concern around the zero balanced budget and the issues that he's heard to be of interest and importance.
With no guarantee that council is going to accept your proposed
Yeah.
budget at the zero base level.
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
it comes back to the table.
Yeah,
Okay,
and at the very end of this meeting, we'll probably talk about which table it's coming back to and when. Yes.
okay. All right. Anything else?
I move that we go on camera to discuss personnel issues as permitted under MGA section 23.
Okay, how many folks are watching from home?
6,
6, does anyone have any questions at this point?
no questions.
Okay, does everybody know that today's your birthday?
Birthday present. Actually brought me. I'm a good friend.
Okay, well, we'll thank the people at home for joining us this morning. And if they think of anything in the next few days, questions, they can contact somebody here in town hall or a member of council. Kelly's going off on a 4-day birthday party, so no, not really. Okay,
We need a seconder for the motion. to go on
yes, we
camera.
do. Deputy Mayor, are you seconding?
Yeah.
Moved and seconded that we go in camera. All in favor? Motion's carried. We'll take 5 minutes while we unplug everything. Uh-oh. That's your birthday present.